Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We'll begin in just a few moments. It's so nice to see everyone. It's so nice to have everyone. We'll begin in a few moments. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Rabbi Yaakov Glasser, and I have the great privilege of serving as the David Mitzner Dean of Yeshiva University's Center for the Jewish Future. I'd like to welcome all of you to a very, very special program this morning, a program that is put together by the Yeshiva University Student Medical Ethics Society. And the title of today's program is From Darkness to Light, a Panoramic View of the Pandemic. I think we all, in gathering together this year for the Medical Ethics Society Conference, recognize that it has been quite a year since the last time we were able to gather for this very conference. And the journey that all of us have taken, be it personal, religious, spiritual, familial, communal, national, and global, has certainly been framed so much by the issues and the challenges that have emerged, in particular, with relation to the topic of medical ethics. This past Shabbos, I was reflecting on the fact that as we recited the Kel Moles for the coming week, because we are now at the beginning of a period of time where we'll be unable to recite the ones coming up, that some of the names that are being included are among the first yahrzeits, the first marking of a year since the passing of those who we lost to the pandemic. And at the same time, we're beginning the conversations in our synagogues and in our schools, in our institutions about the impact of the vaccine, establishing for us a light at the end of the tunnel. So today's title and today's conference, From Darkness to Light, to be able to capture the span of ethical issues, religious issues, moral issues, from the darkness to the light is certainly so apropos and resonates so much with each and every one of us. But what makes today's program particularly special is it is driven by the leadership of our students. And as you will see from a few moments from now, it is really their effort, their ambition, their creativity, and their persistence that have resulted in the extraordinary gathering of scholars and experts, medical professionals, and leaders in the field that we're going to have the opportunity to hear from today. Today's conference is sponsored by the Community Synagogue of Monsey, and it is sponsored in honor of Rabbi Moshe Tendler. Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler is a pioneer in the field of medical ethics. I remember years and years ago sitting in his classroom in Yeshiva University, learning from really one of the individuals who was being called to by Congress and other bodies of government and other official institutions in order to formulate the initial concepts and constructs that really frame all future discussions that we engage in with respect to the world of medical ethics. And that spirit of innovation, that spirit of engaging the contemporary world with our tradition and the values of where we come from continues to thrive in the world of Yeshiva University through our students, through our faculty, through our Rosh Yeshiva, and through the role that our institution has played in leading the community within the context of this very pandemic. And so it is a real privilege and it's a real honor to welcome all of you to today's program. I am now going to turn the program over to our student leaders who will take us through the remainder of the morning. We thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at the many, many upcoming Yeshiva University programs between now and Pesach. In particular, a Yortzeit Shir for Dr. Belkin, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, that's being given by Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, our president, on March 10th, and other such programs that are leading us up to Pesach. Please consult yutorah.org to learn all about those programs. They really reflect the robust span of interests and expertise that is Yeshiva University. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor and privilege to share with you the future leaders of our community in this regard and many others, Tamara and David.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Glasser, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to the 14th annual Yeshiva University Medical Ethics Society Conference, sponsored by the Community Synagogue of Monsey in honor of Rabbi Moshe D. Tendler. My name is Tamara Hoffman, and I am co-president of the Yeshiva University Medical Ethics Society. It is my great privilege to introduce this year's conference theme, Me'afila Liora, From Darkness to Light. This topic choice did not require much deliberation, considering the past year that we have all experienced. The phrase Me'afila Liora can be found in the prayer of Achenu, towards the end of Shacharit, after the reading of the Torah. The Achenu paragraph discusses our nation in distress and our plea to Hashem to remove the suffering from upon them and speedily bring about the redemption. Throughout the past year, we have all felt hardship in different ways. We pray that Hashem will continue to guide us through this difficult time and hope that this pandemic will soon become a memory. After a year filled with uncertainty and distress, we hope that this medical ethics conference can shed light on how far we have come since last March, and with treatments, vaccines, and the leadership of health professionals and rabbinical authorities, Hashem is truly guiding us from darkness to light. Before asking the conference chairman, Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman, to say a few introductory remarks, we would like to thank everyone at the YU Office of Student Life and the Center for the Jewish Future, specifically to Rabbi Glasser for participating and overseeing the conference, and to Rabbi Dov Winston and Rabbi Rob Shore, who have worked with us over the past few weeks to coordinate all of the conference details and logistics, especially over the new virtual platform. Lastly, we would like to express our immense gratitude to our entire Medical Ethics Society board, especially to our conference team members. Rabbi Dr. Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and professor of education and bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He is a full-time clinical practitioner in emergency medicine at Montefiore Medical Center and lectures internationally and writes extensively on Jewish medical ethics and history. His latest work is a comprehensive publication on pandemics in Jewish history. Rabbi Dr. Reichman has been the mentor for the YU Medical Ethics Society since its inception, and his invaluable guidance and advice has allowed us to further our mission of educating the students at Yeshiva University and the broader Jewish community on the most relevant medical ethics issue of our times. With countless calls, emails, and meetings, Rabbi Dr. Reichman has been instrumental as our conference chairman in putting this conference together. And now gives me great pleasure to present our conference chairman, Rabbi Dr. Reichman.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Tremendously appreciated. Good morning to everybody. Baruch Shechianu v'kiyumanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. It's been a very challenging and difficult year for all of us. And it's amazing to see so many of you joining for this conference this morning. Firstly and foremost, I want to thank Tamara and David for an extraordinary job in putting this conference together. They are two exceptional people with an exceptional team, and I'm sure you're all clapping with me at home on your Zooms. I also want to thank President Berman and the CJF for their vision in supporting and nurturing the Medical Ethics Society, which I have had the tremendous honor and schus of mentoring, as Tamara said, since its inception. I just want to inject a little historical perspective today. I'm holding a book that is over 300 years old by Yaakov Tzahalon, who was both a rabbi and a physician during the plague in Rome in 1656. Here he talks about his experiences as both rabbi and physician during the plague. And some of you may have heard it is in this book that he mentions that the shuls were closed, and he gave his drushos from the balcony in the ghetto in Rome. But it is the very end of his section on the plague that I just want to mention briefly before our conference today. In the last few sentences, he ends in a positive though bittersweet note. And he mentions that a pregnant woman entered an isolation house in the ghetto in Rome, and she gave birth to a child there, which she was able to nurse briefly, but tragically she did not survive. But the bris of this child was held in the isolation house, and the child survived and lived to continue many generations afterwards. And he ends with the phrase, "Ve'omar loch b'domayich chayi, ve'omar loch b'domayich chayi." In its context, it was meant to instill a sense of hope that despite the loss of life, the generations would continue. Surely these words are just as applicable today as they were then. But little did he know how prophetic these words would be in the current pandemic and in the medical treatments that we now have. We can also invoke this phrase, b'domayich chayi, but in a physiological sense. With the grace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have extraordinary treatments that harness our blood to cure disease and perpetuate life. And we will talk about these advances in our conference today, such as convalescent plasma, monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, be they mRNA vaccines or other vaccines, all use our blood in order to assist us to create and to perpetuate life. Enjoy this amazing conference, which includes scientists, clinicians, and rabbis of international renown. You will not only learn immeasurably from them, you will surely take pride in the Kiddush Hashem that each one of them has generated. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Reichman, not only for sharing some words with us, but also for all your help throughout the conference planning process. Your guidance has been truly invaluable. My name is David Hanel, and I'm the co-president of the YU Medical Ethics Society. This year's conference will be divided into 3 different topics. We will first hear the scientific developments over the past year in terms of both COVID-19 treatment and vaccination. Then we will hear from frontline healthcare professionals on their personal experiences treating patients and navigating this time, followed by an exploration into a variety of halachic topics. I would like to thank our speakers in advance for giving us their time and sharing their expertise with us. Unfortunately, this year we will not be able to hear from Rav Moshe Tendler at our conference. Rav Tendler is a pillar in the bioethics community and has been involved with the Medical Ethics Society for many years. We would like to wish Rav Tendler a complete refuah shlema and hope to have him participate at many of our conferences in the future. Today we have the special honor of being joined by Rabbi Dr. Berman, President of Yeshiva University. Your encouragement and dedication to our society is tremendously appreciated, and we are grateful to have you here to share some words with us. Without further ado, President Berman.
Okay, hello there, David. If somebody could, there we go. Now I'm on. Okay, David, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tamar, for your incredible leadership in hosting and organizing and the whole medical society for Yeshiva University. Thank you, Rabbi Glasser, for your continued support, help, and partnership in building this great enterprise of bringing our incredible values to life and into our community. And of course, Dr. Eddie Reichman, my dear friend, for everything he's doing to shepherd Yeshiva University and our students through this new era where our values are primary and are really at a center stage. It's my honor to welcome all the panelists, all the speakers, the doctors, the rabbis, clinicians. It's an awesome expression of the power of our community to bring together such elite people, both in the field and in the Beit Midrash. And I'm very excited to hear and to participate in this conference. You know, the theme that Tamara said is Me'afela Liora, from darkness to light. And I think that we see this, we've seen this over this year, but I think it's more than just this year. And it's very, very specific and very tied to the next phrase that's found in the Mishnah Pesachim, which is Mishibud Legeula. You know, just more than, I guess, a year ago when we were still in person and people still had events, I had the opportunity to speak at a conference for the CCCU, the College of the Christian colleges across the country, had an event where they asked me to participate with presidents of other religions to talk about what we saw as the challenges for the coming era. And one of the things that struck me was that they kept on focusing on the challenges and the difficulties for organized religion and for faith in the country and in society today. And what I said to them is, I see this time as a time of opportunity. I said, the world is changing at an enormous pace. And we have the texts, the values, the depth to apply to current situations that others aren't blessed to have. I remember that MIT started Innovation and Ethics Center. And, one of their first studies was the, self-driving car famous dilemma of who, the trolley car dilemma. And the way they resolved it was by taking a survey across the world to hear what people thought, an appreciable number of which likened hitting a person to hitting a dog. And it's just so striking that the bereft of text and thousands of years of thought and belief in Torah Emet, where it leaves you and where it leaves us, which is a tradition that's deep and layered and meaningful and subtle and yet clear on our values. And that today, more than any other time, I mentioned to the conference, people are turning to us. And they're turning and they're interested. Ki chachmatchem ubinatchem beinei ha'amim. They're interested in knowing what the Torah has to say. What are our ideas? And I think we've seen this year, especially as the rabbis and thinkers and doctors and medical professionals in our community have led the way on the most challenging, complex, moral, ethical, halachic questions that have come up this year. And it highlights not just this specific issue, but the important place our community plays in the moral dialogue of contemporary times. And I think this conference speaks directly to that, to flesh out the issues that are at stake, the experiences that people have on the front line, and the Jewish thought that applies to it. It's not just important for today, it's important for our mission of Mishibod L'Geula, not just Me'afela Liora, but Mishibod L'Geula, to bring Jewish values out into the world and to embody it and embrace it and model it and project it. And that's what our students do. That's what we do best. That's what Yeshiva University does. We educate the leaders of tomorrow who have the knowledge, wisdom, and capacity, not just to protect our values, but to project our values. And I think this conference is a real expression of that. I'm very excited about it. I thank again Tamara and David for organizing and all of the help that the CJF and everyone has given, Dr. Reichman, all the panelists. It's a very special morning because it represents what we do and what we do best and the role that we play, not just in the lives of our students, but the roles that our students play and can play in their future, the Jewish people and our broader society. And may we be zocha in this very challenging year as we pray that it looks as it's taking turning a new corner into this mid-vaccine, B'ezrat Hashem soon post-vaccine era, that we not just experience Me'afela Liora, but also Mishibud L'Geula.
Thank you, President Berman, for joining us today. It is an honor to have you here with us. My name is Daphna Levine, and I am one of the vice presidents of the YU Medical Ethics Society. With the emergence of the novel coronavirus, the need for the rapid development of both therapies and vaccines was more dire than ever. These complex developmental processes were forced to be streamlined as the spread worsened daily. We are extremely grateful and fortunate to be joined by two experts who have been vital in the development of COVID-19 treatment and vaccination protocols, respectively. After we hear from both speakers, we will be holding a question and answer session. So should you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We will first hear from Dr. Jill Horowitz, who is the Executive Director of Strategic Operations at Rockefeller University's Laboratory of Molecular Immunology. Before holding this position, she worked at the National Institutes of Health, the US Food and Drug Administration, and in various pharmaceutical companies, including Wyeth Pharmaceuticals, Novartis, and Pfizer. She earned a BA in biochemistry from Barnard College and a PhD in molecular pharmacology from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, after which she completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the NIH. In the past year, she worked with her team at Rockefeller University to develop a monoclonal antibody treatment for the coronavirus. I am honored to present Dr. Horowitz.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to have this discussion. It's, as the speakers before me have said, it's incredibly important, becoming more so each day. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity. Can I share my slides now? It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
You should be able to now, Dr. Horowitz.
Okay, give me 1 second. Here we go. Okay, let me just put on the show. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So let's see, I think last December, scientists started getting concerned about what we were reading in the newspaper and seeing in the scientific journals. And I think it was in December or maybe early January, we at the Rockefeller and many other leaders in treating infectious diseases were contacted by Tony Fauci, who really, as everyone I think is aware, really leads the world, I think, in infectious diseases research. And we know Tony because the NIH has supported our lab and other labs at the Rockefeller for years, developing monoclonal antibodies against HIV. And we've also begun to develop them for other infectious diseases. And you know, Tony said, I think this is going to be a problem, and would we be able to add a supplement to one of your existing grants to start to develop these against this new virus? And we said, yes. So that's where our journey began. But before I get to our work, I'm going to talk about treatments for COVID-19 in general. So first, hold on 1 second, let's see. Okay, first a little bit about the virus. So we got this beautiful micrograph on the left side of your screen from the NIH, which shows the coronavirus, and you can see why it's called the coronavirus. Surrounding each viral particle is what has been dubbed the corona, and is made up of what's been known as the spike protein. And you can see in the schematic in the center of this slide, the spike protein around the outside of the viral particle, and the RNA wrapped in a helix on the inside. It's covered by a protein called the nucleocapsid protein, and the RNA is the genetic. This particular virus carries its genetic material as RNA rather than DNA, and essentially, like all viruses, uses the machinery of the host cell, and in this case, the hosts are people and animals, to replicate itself. And there are other proteins. There's a membrane glycoprotein that sits inside the membrane, and a glycoprotein is simply a protein that has sugars attached to it. There's also an envelope protein that sits on the outside of the virus. But the one we're going to be talking most about today is the spike protein. And you can see that this schematic is from a review from 2009, because these viruses have been, coronaviruses were discovered in 1965, but they ascended from the family tree that you see on the right here, the order of Nidovirales, and there are several families from under that order. Among them are the Coronaviridae, and the subfamily that we're talking about are the Coronavirinae, where there are 3 or 4 genesis known at this point. And this is actually from a review that it's one of those recent reviews that I could find it was actually published in November. I think it went online in June, but it was actually published in paper in November of 2019. So it was before SARS-CoV-2 was discovered, but you can see that among, in the beta coronavirus genus, there are several lineages, and SARS-CoV-2 is lineage B. It's closely related to MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus. And if SARS-CoV-2 was on this chart, it would be under SARS-CoV, which is respiratory distress virus, virus that causes the syndrome that was understood before SARS-CoV-2. So this is the immediate progenitor of the virus that we're dealing with now. Okay, so a little bit about the life cycle of the virus. So the virus, and on this slide, it's important, what you can see on this slide are all of the potential treatments are shown in pink. And the way treatments work is that you're looking for a target, and viruses use, as we said a little bit earlier, viruses use they use the host cell. They're not really alive until they get into the host cell. So viruses really don't have a lot of targets, which is why there are very few antivirals. So what's shown in pink here on all of these different steps of the viral life cycle are drugs that are thought to be potentially effective against various viral targets. The reason that it's hard to find viral targets is, as I said, viruses share a lot of the host cell machinery. And so anything that is active against a viral target may also be active against the host. So the trick is, with all drugs, but in particular with antivirals, the trick is to find a therapeutic level, a dose that helps you without also targeting some normal function of your cells. So that's what we call selective toxicity in drug development. So the treatments shown here are, for the most part, small molecule, what we would call small molecules. And they're just traditional drugs. You don't have to make them in a bioreactor. You can synthesize them. Interferon, for example, it's a peptide that actually is a natural product, and your body makes interferon to control viruses, but it also makes interferon, to help you. So it's maybe not such a great antiviral, because if you get rid of it, or if you express it inappropriately, it can be toxic. So the virus, to go back to the viral life cycle, the virus, step one, the virus comes and then fuses to the receptor on the surface of the cell. Many human cells have the ACE2 molecule, which is the receptor for the coronavirus on the outside. Cardiac muscle has it, lung has it, endothelial cells that line your vessels have it, which is one of the reasons why SARS-CoV-2 has so many different effects on humans and is so dangerous. And one thing that I remember, that just about a year ago, when the structure of the virus was published in Science magazine, and the binding to human cells was characterized, I remember that what struck me was that the tightness of binding between the spike protein and the ACE2 receptor is 10 times tighter than its predecessor virus, than the SARS virus. And I remember thinking to myself, that is not good for us. That means that, a couple of viral particles and, you are going to get sick. So the virus binds to the receptor, and it comes into the cell by a process where the membrane pinches off called endocytosis. And that's where chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine might have been useful. This is a pH-dependent process, and they are small molecules that change the pH of the blood, which can impact endocytosis. The problem with them is they don't have a very good therapeutic window, because you need to have endocytosis in order to function. So they have proven to not be useful against SARS-CoV-2. So the virus comes into the cell, and in a pH-dependent process, the nucleic acid, that's the RNA, is released and then gets translated into a long protein molecule, which then has to be cleaved by proteases in a process called proteolysis. And there are several antivirals that are shown here that have been effective against other viruses that were looked at against SARS-CoV-2. They did not have they were not very effective against this process. So, I don't know that people are still working on them as treatments. But one of the more promising treatments, the target is the next step of the viral life cycle, and that's the RNA, the RDRP, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So remdesivir, which I'm sure you have heard a lot about and is used in the clinic now, is an inhibitor of the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. And the job of that enzyme is to copy that a long strand of RNA so that you can make a long viral transcript. And some of that transcript is then translated into protein, and the protein and the viral RNA then actually self-assemble into a new viral particle, which is then popped out of the cell by exocytosis. So that's essentially the viral life cycle. And remdesivir, which is what we'll be talking a little bit about because it is a treatment, targets this RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. The other thing I wanted to say when I showed this slide is that someone will ask about the variants, so it's probably good to start to talk about them now. So the variants happen because viruses replicate, everything that's living replicates, and the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase is the enzyme that replicates the viral RNA. But it's not a perfect enzyme, it makes mistakes, and that's how evolution happens. So it's a normal process, and that's how viruses evolve from each other. And it's very easy to see viral evolution. That's how the family tree on the previous slide was put together, because we can actually see the mistakes that the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase makes, and we can see how new viruses evolve from parental viruses over time. And viruses, just in case anyone's wondering, are among the oldest things in the universe, and they're at least 3.5 billion years old. So some people think they were the first forms of life. But in any case, so the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase makes mistakes, the virus evolves, and some of those mistakes prevent it from replicating, but some of those mistakes are not so bad, and the virus will still undergo its life cycle and will fold and will go out into the blood and replicate, and that's how you get variants. So the issue is if that happens, let's say 1 in 100 times, it doesn't happen that frequently. You won't get that many variants if only 100 people have the virus. And by the way, you have billions of copies of virus in you if you have this virus. So 1 in 100, that's not so bad. But if it's 1 in 100 and you have 100,000 people who have the virus, that's a lot worse. And we have many, many millions of people that have the virus. So there are many, many, many opportunities for this virus to evolve, and that's what it does. And so the issue that we're facing now, because we didn't act early in the pandemic, is that we have so many people who are harboring virus now that we have these variants coming up very quickly. And some of them, what we have seen, we can replicate evolution in the laboratory. We can replicate the selective pressure that is applied that allows these variants to circulate. And what we can see is that some of the variants are vulnerable to the current vaccines and the current therapies, but others are less so. So the issue that we have is it's kind of a race between vaccination and the spread of the variants. So that's why it's so important to prevent viral spread, even if you are vaccinated and even if you are not worried about getting sick yourself, you know, simply by allowing the virus to spread around, we're promoting the more dangerous forms of the virus. So that's an ethical issue that I'm sure we will get around to. In any case, so a little bit about the protein itself. I'm sorry, somebody has a question. Should I be answering questions along the way?
No, don't worry about it.
Okay. So a little bit about the protein. So the coronavirus spike protein, there's a schematic of it here on the left. The fusion and that fuses with the cell is toward the end. The attachment part is at the beginning. And you see here what is shown as the RBD. It's 234 amino acids long, and the RBD is the receptor binding domain. That's the part that interacts with the ACE2 receptor on the surface of cells. And that's very important. We're going to be talking about it more, so I wanted to point it out. And then on the right here this is a space, what we call a space filling model of the spike protein and the human ACE receptor. So the spike protein is shown in purple, like a lavender. And the reason there are gray and white proteins behind it is that it occurs as a trimer on the surface of the virus. So this purple one is just one, and it's bound. It has its spike RBD in gold, and you can see that the RBD is, you know, attached, essentially very tightly attached to the human ACE2 receptor, which is shown in green. So that's something that's worth keeping in mind. And these are, as I said, these are space-filling molecules that really show the three-dimensional arrangement of these long polypeptide chains and how they really wrap around themselves and form these very particular space-filling three-dimensional, you know, models in 3D space. Okay, so now the disease itself. So the stages of the disease are shown on this slide, and the thing I think that's important to remember for the treatment talk is that, you know, the severity of illness is on the y-axis, time is on the x-axis. So in stage 1, you know, you've got the virus. You may not have any symptoms. You may have minimal symptoms. They're not so bad, but you know, you've got a lot of virus on board, and it's replicating, and it's leading to the second stage where what we call the host inflammatory response takes over. And some of the symptoms start to get worse then and make themselves apparent. And finally, you know, the final stage, the virus really isn't causing disease anymore, but the host inflammatory response, that's your inflammatory response, is causing severe disease. And you know, that's really what becomes very, very problematic for people. So what happens is that antivirals like remdesivir will be more effective in the early stage because that's when the disease is really caused by the virus. Convalescent plasma is also apparently more effective in the viral stage. But when you get into the post-inflammatory stage, what has proven to be effective are corticosteroids, which of which dexamethasone is an example. And dexamethasone was discovered in 1957 and approved in 1961, and has been used, you know, a lot clinically because it damps down some of the dangerous effects of inflammation. So the next slide shows the therapies that have promising results, among them remdesivir and dexamethasone. And you can see remdesivir on the left, you can see the data that shows that, in fact, that it does shorten the time to recovery even in hospitalized patients. And so it's given in the hospital. Dexamethasone, the graph on the right, shows that mortality is lower in dexamethasone when looked at in 28 days after administering it to hospitalized patients. So dexamethasone, as I said, was already in use and didn't need a new approval. Remdesivir was actually developed as an antiviral for Ebola. It was put aside when monoclonal antibodies proved to be much more effective, and was brought out again for this virus. And it, you know, it's not a perfect antiviral, but it works well enough to have received an emergency use approval from the FDA, which is not the same as a full approval, but essentially it is what it says. It is approved for use in emergencies. And so that's what, you know, patients in the hospital, you know, will get in order to help them to recover more quickly. Okay, so convalescent plasma is another treatment that has emergency use approval. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that approval actually says. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what is convalescent plasma. So now we've left the realm of what I was talking about before, the small molecules, which are really the drugs that, you know, are small molecules. They're not expensive to make. They're easy to make. They're typically oral. But they need a target, and they have a tendency to, you know, you need to find a therapeutic window because, as I said, the target, sometimes they share the target with a host. And so you need to find a dose that's going to cure the disease and not hurt the patient. Convalescent plasma is something very different. It's a biologic, and what it depends upon is people getting well from the disease. So what happens when you get the virus is that your immune system learns to recognize the virus, and eventually, hopefully after a few weeks, you know, recruits all of the different complex parts of your immune system to kill the virus, not only to kill the virus, but to kill the cells that are infected with the virus. And you know, that's your system that has evolved that helps you to fight off foreign invaders. So this is what a tube of blood looks like after you spin it in a centrifuge. So if somebody got sick with COVID and then they got well, they can come into the hospital and then they can donate blood, and the blood, you can spin it in a centrifuge. And if you do, you get these three layers that are shown on this slide. So you get the red blood cells, they're heavy and big, they go to the bottom of the tube. You get at the interface between the plasma and the white and red blood, you get white blood cells and platelets. So platelets allow you to clot and make scabs. And the white blood cells contain all of your immune cells, B cells, T cells, lots of other cells, and they all have jobs, and they all get recruited into action to kill foreign invaders like viruses. So that's what these cells are all like up here. And so above the white blood cells and the platelets, you get this layer of liquid that's always described as straw colored, and that is your plasma. And what's in the plasma is water, gases, nutrients, but we're going to be talking about proteins. And the most important protein that we're going to be talking about today are antibodies. And one thing I want to say about convalescent plasma is that, you know, the antibodies are essentially the magic ingredient that people who have recovered harbor in their plasma. But plasma is, there are a couple of drawbacks. Well, there were three main drawbacks. One is it's not scalable. You take the plasma from one person and you put it into another person. You can't make it in a factory. So that's very important. Another one is the plasma, the antibodies that are in the plasma are just a mix. You know, there's millions of antibodies that you harbor, and the production of antibodies against any disease is a dynamic process. You start out, you know, you think that all cells in your body have the same DNA. Well, that's true in general, but it's not true about your immune system cells. You are born with a repertoire of, you know, a few million immune cells with a few million different DNA, you know, kinds of DNA or sequences of DNA in them. But over time, your immune system learns to recognize the invader and is stimulated to produce more cells that make the right antibodies against that invader. Okay, so immune cells actually go into your lymph nodes and your spleen, and there is a process by which they become educated, and the clones of cells that recognize the virus expand, and you produce lots and lots and more of antibodies that recruit in all these other cells that not only kill the virus, they also kill the cells that are infected with the virus. And even more important, and this you will get to vaccines, you'll hear more about later, you produce memory B cells, and the memory cells have antibodies, and they remember the virus. So years later, you can have a booster for DTP or another vaccination that you got when you were a child, and you can stimulate the production of those cells. So, it's really pretty good system that evolution has provided us with, but it's a very dynamic system. So convalescent plasma is just a giant mix of not so good antibodies and good antibodies. So, it's not perfect, but it can be helpful. And so, as I said, convalescent plasma is a mixture of antibodies from people who have recovered. And just to sort of hammer that point home, this is a schematic of an antibody. The blue, there are 4 polypeptide chains, 2 heavy chains, those are the very long ones, and 2 light chains, those are the short ones. The dark blue are constant regions, so the DNA that codes for those parts of the protein is the same in all cells, but at the end you have these antigen binding fragments. These are the variable domains, and they are educated over time to recognize the antigen. And in our case, we're going to be talking mostly about the receptor binding domain of the S protein is the antigen. And you saw on that earlier slide the interaction between the antigen or the place where the S protein, which is the antigen, would be, and then the antibody would presumably interrupt that recognition of the spike protein by the receptor and actually prevent binding of the spike protein onto the receptor. So the virus won't even get into your cells. So in addition to preventing binding, an antibody will recruit the immune system and actually kill cells that have the virus. So it's really a kind of a therapy that can be very effective. So convalescent plasma, what do we know about it? So right now, I looked the other day, there are 180 active studies that are listed on this big database called clintrials.gov that anybody can look at. You can look at. It's pretty easy to search. So if you're ever curious about this, just go on to clintrials.gov. It's run by the NIH, and it lists all the clinical trials that are happening, at least in the US, and Europe has a similar system. 31 have been completed or stopped early. And I just took 2 recent studies out. Somebody sent me another one. There's another one the other day. And so basically the conclusion is they're kind of mixed. You can see on the left the results from a study of 160 people, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study that was published in January of 160 people, people who are at risk and are early in the course of their disease, less than 3 days after the onset of symptoms. So presumably these people still have plenty of virus on board. And the good news is there were no safety signals, that it looks safe. That isn't necessarily, a given, so you have to look at safety. But the nice thing is that the relative risk of severe respiratory disease was half in treated versus placebo patients. So that was good, and certainly that supports an emergency use authorization. Back in October, and this is just an example, there was an open label trial done in India of a larger number of patients. And when they do an open label trial, it's not a prospective, it's a retrospective trial. They're not really the gold standard, but sometimes we have to do them because once a treatment or an intervention is approved, even if it's only for emergency use, ethically, you have to offer it to the patients, and very often the patients know about this and they want it. So you can't ever withhold treatment, right? That's unethical. And so it becomes harder to do placebo-controlled trials, and placebo-controlled trials are really the gold standard, as I said, and they're the trials that we learn the most from. So you have an ethical issue that we struggle with all the time, but that's just one that's out there. So this trial in October, and in fact, another trial that was just published the other day, show no meaningful difference in progression to severe disease. So, part of the explanation for why the trials are mixed has to do with the titer of the sera. As I said, these seras they're mixtures of many, many different antibodies from many, many different people. You can test for the potency, you can look for the more effective antibodies in these sera. And in this trial in India, the median titer, that's the potency, is 1 to 40, which means you start to lose the signal, lose the potency after you dilute the sera more than 1 to 40. So that's not considered really such a potent sera, whereas this one on the left that was effective, actually the mean titer was 1 to 3,200. So you can dilute the one on the left much, much more than you can the one on the right. That may explain why one of them was effective and one of them was not effective. But you can see right away that this treatment has drawbacks. So that's convalescent plasma. Now, what if you could extract the best antibodies from convalescent plasma? Well, you can, and that's what the monoclonal antibodies are. So just a little poster about what the antibodies are. Here's the spike protein, here's the host cell receptor, that's the ACE2 molecule. And these monoclonal antibodies are shown here as a cartoon, and you can see that they are blocking the end of the S protein, that's where the receptor binding domain is. And not only do they prevent the virus from attacking, but as I said, they also tag it for destruction. So, these can be very, very effective drugs, but how do you get them? Well, I'll go over how we got them later. There are a few different ways of getting them. So how did we get them? So we fished them out of people's sera. After Tony called us, we did a clinical trial where we collected convalescent serum. And then we used an instrument called a fluorescence activated cell sorter. So what you do is you label the S, you have to have the S protein, which was kind of circulating around the scientific community at that point. You can label it with a fluorescent tag, and then you can let it sit with the patient's B cells, which have antibodies on the outside of them. It will bind tightly to the B cells that have the right antibodies. And then this instrument essentially shoots them through a tiny, tiny, tiny little hole and shines a light on them. And the ones that light up, it routes them, to one collection tube, and the ones that don't light up so much, it routes them to a different tube. So you can see here, so here's a control on the left, and then this terminology, COV47, 21, et cetera, those are the anonymized names of the people who came into our trial. And you can see that these people, it's capturing fluorescence from these people, which is showing that there's these very, very tiny numbers, 0.029%, 0.021%, but tiny, but definable percent of their B cells have, are binding to the S protein. So those were the antibodies that we captured and then ultimately were able to develop into a therapy. Tony didn't just call us, he called lots of other scientists all over the world, and a couple of companies, of course, were able to develop their own antibodies. And so you see here in January.
That's going to be an issue, which is going to be challenging in Israel.
Sorry. So you see here that, so on the left, you see the recently published results from This is the Regeneron cocktail on the left and the Eli Lilly single antibody on the right. And so you can see that I think Regeneron got one of they have a cocktail, as I said, 2 antibodies that work very well. They got one of their antibodies, I think, from recovered patients in China. They started developing it, these antibodies back in January. And I think Lilly also got their antibody from the early phases of the study, their colleagues in China. And I think through the WHO, they both got them. I think Regeneron developed the second antibody in-house. They have another way of developing antibodies once you have the sequence of the protein the antigen that you're interested in. So they started, way before we did, because, they're a company and they could. And they gave a couple of doses, and what they found, you can see the data here, you can see the spreads, between all of these, controls and treatment arms. So again, they found no safety signal, which was great. And they found a 3-fold drop in the amount of virus on day 7. And they found half as many patients in the treatment groups as in the placebo had at least one medically attended visit by day 28. So this is extremely effective. And the nice thing about a cocktail is that if the virus escapes because of selective pressure from one of the antibodies, the other one will catch it. So it's we really never see escape when we use 2 antibodies together. And Lilly has since then gotten emergency use approval for a second antibody, and now Lilly has a cocktail. But this data was from their single antibody, and they, both companies did several doses because everything was very expedited. And Lilly essentially found the same thing. You can develop these. Both of these are available for emergency use. There is the biggest drawback, I think, of both of these is that they are intravenous infusions because they want to give a lot of antibody. But if you develop an extremely potent antibody like we did, and you can give it as a shot. And so ours is a shot, which we think will be much more useful, because if you want an infusion now, you have to arrange for it. It's not that easy. And you may not get it the next day. And as I was saying earlier, these antibodies are really much more useful in the early stages of the disease, where you have a lot of virus on board and you're really sick from the virus and not from the host inflammatory response. So one of the ethical issues, though, I would say is, for these antibodies is that because they're biologics and you have to grow them in a bioreactor, and they take a while and they need lots of controls, because the bioreactor process is not as simple as a chemical process. They're expensive, and we would ideally want them available for everybody everywhere, because there's just not a lot of good treatments around, and we're going to need treatments for a while because there's just a ton of virus around. And now we have these variants, so there will be many cases for many years to come. So I think the biggest ethical challenge that you have with the monoclonals is probably cost. So that's something that we will all have to think about moving forward, is how we can.
Dr. Harless?
Yep.
Hi, are you able to just wrap up so we can move on to the next panelist?
Yeah, so we did the same thing. We got very potent antibodies. We, developed them with the help of Bristol Myers Squibb. We put them into people. Bristol Myers Squibb licensed them, and then we finished. And thank you for all the, mostly from the NIH, and these are all the people that worked on the study. So I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horowitz, for your informative presentation. It was really interesting. My name is Leva Sullivan, and I'm a member of the Medical Ethics Society Board. Today, we are incredibly grateful to be joined by Dr. Naor Bar-Zeev, who is the Deputy Director of the International Vaccine Access Center at Johns Hopkins University. He is a pediatric infectious disease specialist, as well as a statistical epidemiologist. Dr. Bar-Zeev completed his MBBS at Monash University in Australia, and later went on to receive his PhD from Charles Darwin University. Dr. Bar-Zeev has extensive experience in the vaccine science, including previously acting as a senior scientist of the Vaccines Research Group at Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Program at the University of Malawi. as well as being a part of the Malawi National Immunization Advisory Group. Notably, Dr. Bar-Zeev has also published multiple papers recently pertaining to the COVID-19 vaccine, including COVID-19 vaccines, early successes and remaining challenges, as well as expecting the unexpected with the COVID-19 vaccine. After Dr. Bar-Zeev's presentation, we will be holding a question and answer session for both Dr. Horowitz and Dr. Bar-Zeev. Please continue sending any questions you may have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I am now honored to call up Dr. Bar-Zeev.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm trying to start my video, but I think I can't. I'm getting a message that I'm not authorized because the host has stopped. So here we go. Okay, hi, great. Nice to see you all. Nice to be seen. Thanks very much for having me. An honor to be here and a fun opportunity to weave together Torah and Madda, really. So you'll forgive me if I just have some fun as we talk through some of the ethical challenges. I think the focus of the seminar is ethics. So what I'd like to talk about is the challenges of vaccine development and vaccine implementational work, but to bring into that some of the ethical elements as we go through. So thanks very much. So I guess the first thing that ethics is really a question about how ought we to act. And before we start about how we should act, I think it's also important as individuals to ask how ought I personally to respond to what we're seeing. And we just heard from Dr. Horowitz, a wonderful exposition of the real unfolding of biology in real time in front of us. And the words that come to mind are the Rambam's famous words in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, where he says, "Nirta la'achora," where a person sees the wonder of the Bria and the complexity and the richness and the depth and and one is thrown backwards really from the awe of it all. And the yira of it all. And I think it's with that level of humility that we then can turn around and think about what can we do and how do we achieve both Avas Hashem as the next level, but also Avas Abrius, and being able to really reach out and act scientifically in a way that's rigorous but true to the science. So I think that initial emotional response isn't separate from the way we act ethically. The next question then obviously becomes, how ought we to act collectively? How do we make rational public policy? How do we deal with dissension in public policy? How do we deal with groups that disagree with us? And again, I'm just, I think in Eduyot, we've got both the Mishnah and interestingly, a reversal in the Tosefta, where Rabbi Yehuda asks, why do we even mention a minority opinion levatala? If we're not going to pass according to the minority opinion, why do we even bother mentioning the minority opinion? And there's an interesting mahalach there, and I'd encourage you all to look at it. But clearly, we have a tradition where the minority opinion is always brought, and it's always important to listen to opinions that differ from the mainstream and from the majority. And I think that's the strength of what we can bring to this discourse. Clearly, another very important issue relates beyond the science, but to the operational side of things, and these are distributional questions. And they're not just straightforward questions. We heard the opening, the president spoke about the trolley problem. It's not only a Mai Chazis problem of Mai Chazis, the Damach Sumak Tfei, how do you know whose blood is redder, so to speak? But this is really, writ large, a very difficult problem of distribution. Who gets vaccinated? How do we fund distribution of vaccines? Who should be accessing and be given access to vaccines? How do we do that equitably and justly? And what is the role of equity when it comes to these decisions? So all of these things are interwoven with vaccine development and vaccine policy. But to best understand these sugyas, these issues, you really have to understand the fundamental science. And I guess that speaks to a broader principle, or a broader idea, which is that ethical principles don't exist in the abstract. Okay, they exist in the pragmatic. And I think we have to prioritize the pragmatic outcome. What will be the nafka what actually will happen on the ground, is going to be much more important than what ought we to do in some abstract sense. Because lots of good intentions and lots of well-meant ethical principles become undone when you don't consider their consequences on the ground. So I think that's also very important to understand how the science translates to actual events on the ground for human beings. Okay, so let's go through some of the issues. So we've obviously have achieved this point. We're a year through this pandemic. We have a very large number of vaccine candidates going through clinical trials. Dr. Horowitz mentioned clinicaltrials.gov. You can look yourselves there. And a very large number already also in phase 1, 2, and now we have phase 3 results, and we have rollout of actual vaccines. The time from the first publication of publicity around the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the production of an mRNA vaccine was about 6 weeks, which is really a remarkable thing. From then, so in other words, it only took a few weeks till we had a vaccine candidate. From then until it was rolled out was really about evaluating its safety and evaluating its efficacy. Safety and immunogenicity, that means the ability of the virus to cause the body to mount an immune response. And then efficacy in the context of reducing clinical outcomes, reducing clinical disease. All of that took those months that it took to achieve what we've achieved. But the capacity to produce, the scientific capacity to produce the vaccines was there from very early on. And again, that's a remarkable testament to what we're able to do scientifically. So how did the vaccines work? What did they do? Really very briefly, the vaccines enter the body, as we heard. They enter the cytoplasm, the outside of the cell, and they release the mRNA, which is the message that the body then uses to produce protein, the process called translation. The protein is essentially the code of the spike protein is given to the cell produces that protein endogenously, presents it on its surface, and the immune system recognizes that protein as foreign and then mounts an immune response. That's fundamentally how these vaccines work. The adenovirus vectored vaccines work similarly, except they go through the nucleus to use the DNA replication process to have that happen, and the mRNA stays in the cytosol. Fundamentally, that's how those vaccines work. They're novel in the sense that previous vaccines have not used the cell's replicating mechanisms to do that. They've presented usually the antigen directly to the immune system. And these vaccines don't do that. And that is novel, although they've been in development for a decade and a half, almost 2 decades. There have been previous vaccines developed from these, but not to the point of full licensure. Adenovirus vector vaccines got licensure in July of 2000, so relatively recently with the Ebola virus vaccine. And obviously now we're seeing emergency use authorization for the mRNA vaccines. Okay, so what should we expect the vaccine to do? I mean, what would an ideal vaccine do? Well, an ideal vaccine would obviously reduce disease and death, would eradicate disease and death from the target condition. It would also reduce infection and transmission, and we'll talk about that in a moment. They're separate, it's a separate function. What is required for that is entirely sterilizing immunity. The virus comes into my body and it doesn't enter my cells in any way. The next thing that we would want is that the vaccine would induce protection that's long-lived. Ideally, 1 shot and you're done for life. That would be wonderful. The next thing that we would want is that it would provide heterotypic protection. That means that we would give a vaccine and it would protect us against all current variants, all current flavors of coronaviruses, and indeed any future variants that may arise. We want it to be a single dose. We want it to have no side effects. We want it to be cheap to produce. We want it to be able to be mass produced at scale. We want it to be affordable, and we want it to be easy to administer. Now, there isn't a vaccine like that. There isn't a vaccine that has all of those qualities, and the choices of the vaccines that we have and the decisions that were made to produce vaccines quickly was a trade-off among all of those things. And so really the FDA and manufacturers around the world and academics and scientists around the world said, what are the key outcomes that are most important? And how good do we want these vaccines to be before we roll them out? We don't want a vaccine that's perfect if it means that we can't have a vaccine that's good. And so the FDA and the WHO produced a threshold for licensure, which was 50% efficacy, with a lower bound of confidence of 30%. Now, it wasn't entirely clear in the beginning efficacy against what, and there's a Lancet editorial that I would encourage you to look at, which asks the question about worthwhile efficacy. What efficacy is worth pursuing? But as I mentioned before, you could have efficacy against infection. This vaccine prevents infection full stop, but you could also have efficacy against disease and death. And that's what was chosen actually. And for pragmatic reasons, it's somewhat easier to measure, it's easier to target, it's a more pragmatic sample size that's available, but also because from a policy decision, that's what we want to do. We want to switch off the bad effects of this pandemic. We want to stop this pandemic from causing disease and death. And so the vaccines were designed with that in mind, and the trials were designed with that in mind. And in fact, we ended up with vaccines that were remarkably efficacious. We have very, very high efficacy for these vaccines, well above 90%. And that's fantastic. That was a surprise, and a happy surprise at that as well. Not only that, but we've seen, given the very large scale trials that were conducted, that we were able to do subgroup analyses in the elderly, in different races and ethnic groups, in people with comorbidities and other medical conditions. And the vaccine is robust. It retains its efficacy among all of those groups, which is great. And it's especially great among the elderly, because the concern among the elderly was that often the elderly immune system just doesn't get very excited by things, a phenomenon we call immune senescence. And nevertheless, we were able to demonstrate that these vaccines are efficacious in the elderly, and that's really, really important. So we have a vaccine that does reduce disease very well. It reduces death. The question is, does it reduce transmission? Does it reduce infection? And that's a really important question, because it has direct bearing then on public policy and distributional questions, and therefore also on the ethical dimension. And if you think of it like this, if I have a disease, if I have a virus that reduces death and disease, it sounds great, I should give it to everybody, switch off the severe end of the spectrum of the COVID pandemic, and then it doesn't matter anymore if we keep having the virus transmitting through the community, because it's not going to cause death. And that's true if everybody was vaccinated. But clearly we're talking about a limited resource, a resource that we can't give to everybody immediately. We have to prioritize certain groups. So let's imagine, for example, that the vaccine didn't work fantastically in the elderly. Or let's see a reality that we have at the moment, where some groups in the community have lower uptake of the vaccine than other groups. For example, the African-American community, for lots of historical reasons of injustice and so on, that lead them to be concerned more than other groups. The Haredi community maybe has concerns more than other groups, and many other communities have concerns, and uptake in those communities is lower. And if among those groups, as is the case, for example, with the Latino community or the African-American community, we know that both the incidence of coronavirus infection, but also more importantly, the severity given infection is greater in those groups, you end up with a situation where if you give the vaccine to everybody, and as a result of receiving the vaccine, we say, okay, we don't need the masks anymore, and let's go to Megillah reading, and let's have a Seder with 50 people and so on, and transmission is not curtailed, then you end up actually paradoxically increasing transmission in the community. Eventually, within a wave or two, a step or two, you have higher rates of infection among the vulnerable, and paradoxically, the vaccine could result in increased transmission and increased mortality if that were to happen. So what needs to happen is that the focus really has to be on reaching very high levels of coverage among the vulnerable. So for a given level of vaccine dosing that's available, it's a limited resource, it's a finite resource. How should I distribute it? Well, I need to distribute it efficiently and quickly, but I also need to distribute it to those who need it the most. And there's a balance there, because if I'm too strict in my principles or in my rules about distribution, and I say only the vulnerable must receive it, then we end up with ridiculous situations where you have wastage of doses, where at the end of the day, I can't find another person over 65, but I have somebody here who's 64, and I don't give it to them because of that. So clearly we don't want strictness and stringency to the extent where we affect efficiency. On the other hand, we don't want to lose doses to people who are at lower risk, because we know that the greatest benefit is going to be to those who are themselves at risk. Another question might arise, an ethical question might arise, let's say in a nursing home setting. If I vaccinate the people in the nursing home, that's wonderful. But should I also, and the question arises, we probably should also vaccinate staff who work at the nursing home. That's almost an obvious given. But what if those staff don't want to receive the vaccine? And that's been happening, reports of that. Can we really make the case that they ought to receive the vaccine in order to protect others if we don't have the evidence to say that the vaccine reduces transmission, or to what degree it reduces transmission? So I guess what I'm trying to get across, in intuitive terms, is that the science, the immunology and the epidemiology directly determines how decisions should be made. They directly determine the ethical leeway within which those decisions have implication. Now, I'm not suggesting that the vaccines don't reduce infection, and I'm not saying that they don't reduce transmission, but what I am saying is that the trials weren't targeting those outcomes as primary outcomes, and so we don't have quantitative evaluation of those outcomes to the same degree of precision that we do for disease. There is emerging data around this issue, and there are suggested rates of efficacy against infection, that are published, but they are lower than the efficacy against disease. Now, they are higher than what was originally set as that 50% bar for licensure, but they're not massively higher as we saw for disease. So in other words, we're dealing with one product, I mean, I'm grouping all vaccines together, that has multiple levels of efficacy against different targets. And we have to understand the complexity of that if we're going to make ethical decisions that are appropriate and based on evidence and based on the right kind of knowledge. And it's important to be honest and direct about that, because very often, let's say in vaccines, we use the fact that vaccines reduce transmission as a deontological force here. We say you ought to be vaccinated not only to protect yourself, but to reduce transmission in the community, to protect the vulnerable, to protect others. That's a commonplace argument that's made in vaccinology, and so it should. It's extremely true for conditions like measles, for example. Measles vaccine, I should say, works when the bulk of the community is vaccinated because it reduces transmission through herd protection. It's much more effective that way than even in its individual level of protective efficacy. It works because we all receive it. And that may not be as clear-cut the case for COVID vaccines. So we have to be mindful of those issues when we communicate with the public about what their expectations would be. Okay, next. I want to talk about the ethics that relate to running vaccine trials. And again, Dr. Horowitz mentioned some of this, but let's go into it in a little bit more depth. We have EUA, we have emergency use authorization. The emergency use authorization was given in the midst of the phase 3 trials. We know, for example, that the government of the Russian Federation gave approval to the Gamaleya Institute vaccine before they had published their phase 3 results. The Gamaleya vaccine is an excellent vaccine. The results of the phase 3 have been published. They're good, they're solid science. It's a great vaccine, it works very well. But licensure was given before those results were published, even before interim analysis of them was published. And the Russian Federation was criticized for doing that. And their argument was, we have people dying every day all around us. We feel we know enough. We have enough safety data. We have good immunogenicity data. It may not work, but it probably will work. And we feel that it's appropriate to give limited authorization for use in frontline police workers, frontline health workers, and so on. And we're going to start that rollout as we are awaiting the phase 3 trials. And that caused a lot of controversy around the world. Some of that controversy was legitimate, and some of it was driven by vaccine nationalism and the West poo-pooing Russia and so on. There are elements of that and realpolitik in all of this as well, and that's important to recognize that. But I guess my question is, okay, maybe we can raise an eyebrow, maybe that wouldn't be our normal practice, but they have a leg to stand on. They have people dying all around them. They have an ethical, fundamental issue that they want to curtail death, and that's an important reason for them to say, we know enough now to go forward. It raises a deep question of when is enough knowledge enough? There's always going to be uncertainty. And the question is, when do we know enough? So clearly we have to prioritize safety. We don't want to do something that's unsafe. We want to be able to, we don't want to do harm. That's the first principle of medicine, primum non nocere, first do no harm. But first do no harm. We don't just have to sit, cheval taser. We have to explore the possibility of harm. And if the intervention that we have is safe, then we can breathe a sigh of relief and we can say, well, let's now look at how immunogenic it is, how efficacious is it? And then there's a debate which is not driven by the science, it's driven by public policy, by dissenting opinions, by different views on when is enough knowledge enough to go ahead and start to vaccinate. India had the same issue and they approved the Bharat vaccine. Now, again, Bharat has released its phase 3 results. They have 81% efficacy. Pretty good for a killed vaccine, that's really good. But they got approved beforehand and that caused huge controversy in India. Now, before we point fingers at Russia and India, the same issue occurred in the United States. The EUA was given by the FDA, that's true that it was given after the interim analyses of the phase 3 trials, but certainly not by the end of phase 3 trials. The phase 3 trials are continuing. They're continuing to at least 2 years out. So there's always this question of when do we know enough? When is enough enough? How precise do we need to be? How confident do we need to be? How much uncertainty can we tolerate when we make decisions? These are deep issues, and they're not scientific issues. They're meta-scientific issues. They're issues of ethics that envelope the science, okay? So that's an important point, I think, to recognize. But when you come to think about, okay, well, these vaccine trials were supposed to continue out to 2 years. That means I'm randomized to receive a placebo, and I don't know because I'm blinded what I received. But my wife was also randomized, and she got a big fat swollen arm after her dose, and I had nothing. I felt perfectly fine. Thank you very much. I probably got placebo, and lo and behold, and let's say I'm in a Moderna trial, and lo and behold, licensure occurs to Pfizer, and I'm sitting there nervous. I'm sitting here thinking I got placebo. There's now a vaccine that's being given emergency use authorization. Is it ethical for me? Is it ethical that I should continue in a trial under placebo? And after some deliberation and some big, couple of page spreads in the New York Times and so on, decisions pretty much across the board were made to unblind and to vaccinate with licensed vaccines all those people who had received placebo in the existing trials. And that's the right thing to do for the trial participants, but it comes at a loss to what we can know scientifically. And that's a trade-off between our epistemological limits and our ethical limits. What are we willing to tolerate ethically in order to obtain the best available data? And it's a difficult question to answer, and there isn't a straightforward answer to it. People have agreed to take a certain risk, but the question is, did they have in mind that when they agreed a priori to take that risk of receiving placebo, did they really have in mind, was there kavana kivyachol to say, well, in 3 months there's going to be a vaccine? Would they have agreed b'diavad to agree from that time forward or not? It's a good question. And the determination was that they should be vaccinated. So what have we lost? Well, what we've lost is a really important thing, and that is our ability to determine the longevity of the difference between the randomized groups is now lost. In other words, everybody is saying we don't know how long immunity lasts after natural infection. We're also not 100% certain how long immunity after vaccine lasts. We have a sense that it'll last some months. We've got the early enrollees into the clinical trials were vaccinated in June, July. So, we've got a reasonable length of time, but we don't have 2 years out. We don't have 3 years out. We don't have 4 years out. And now we're not going to have them because those people who we would have needed to maintain them as placebos in order to see the difference in incidence between the placebo arm and the intervention arm. That's a trade-off. It's a trade-off where we forego best available science for the sake of acting ethically. And one could argue, you know what? It would be better for us as a world to know how long these vaccines really work because it has huge implications. Do we need to vaccinate again in 3 years? Do we need to do the whole, India is vaccinating billions of people. Now, that's a massive undertaking. The United States, millions of people, that's a massive undertaking. Do we need to do that again? How do we know how soon? How do we know how long? The best available data comes from randomized trials, but now the data from those trials will be lost. So there are answers to how we can deal with this scientifically. And there are some very intriguing ideas of randomizing large populations, as, for example, in the United Kingdom, they do for breast screening to give more or fewer mammograms. More mammograms, they randomize literally the whole of the UK's female population to do that. And there may be a way of building on those infrastructures to answer some of these questions in randomized designs, which are the best designs that set aside confounding and bias. But nevertheless, the problem from an ethical perspective is an important one. When does ethics in the short term, or when does ethics for the participant in front of me trump the long-term benefit that there might be? And if it doesn't, then what's the risk that I can do to the people in front of me for the sake of the? And that's a really dangerous road to start going down. So these are interesting challenges. The other thing that's come out of the clinical trials is this question of human challenge studies. I mean, in an animal study, you can vaccinate and immediately expose the animal to corona. You can infect them with coronavirus and then either measure their responses in blood or even dissect them and take out their lungs and look at the pathology of their lung and so on. Clearly, we can't do that with human beings. But there has been a call for human challenge studies. Let's say we take a young, healthy person in whom the risk of having severe disease is low. And they say, I'm willing, I'm happy to take that risk. I want science to benefit. I want the world to go forward. I want to protect my great-grandparents or my grandparents. I'm at low risk. I'm willing to take the risk. Give me some experimental therapy or an experimental vaccine, and then infect me with COVID, and let's see what happens. Right? Is it ethical to do that? Right? I refer the listeners here to the Aruch HaShulchan, where he has this phrase where it says, Sheyatir damo bishvil acherim. It's a whole sugya. Is a person allowed to spill his own blood, kivyachol, for the sake of others? And there's big halachic discussions about these issues. And, there's been a debate in the scientific literature about human challenge models in this situation. How much risk is too much risk and so on. There's a whole halachic literature on it that's, been discussing these things in our sadly very tragic circumstances in the past. from the Tach and Tat, the Moraot of the pogroms in the past and so on. There've been a lot of these kinds of shalos and chuvas, but in particular that are applicable also to the scientific circumstance. So if anybody out there who's listening wants to do a master's dissertation or a PhD dissertation on these issues at YU, I think that would be a really fascinating dissertation. Very interesting sugya. Okay, so there are some ethics of clinical trials. So I want to address some of the questions that were sent to me through Tamara and the organizers. I want to talk about safety, vaccine safety. Safety is super important. It's the most important issue when it comes to vaccine development. It's the most important thing for me as a human being, because if I'm to receive the vaccine and if I'm going to be giving that vaccine to my family members, I clearly want to know it's safe, just like you all want to know that it's safe. But also as a vaccinologist, I want to know that it's safe, because the harm done from an unsafe vaccine goes beyond the damage that would be done to people with COVID, people for the prevention of COVID. It would break down trust in all vaccines globally. If we were to distribute a vaccine that was unsafe and people would pay the price for that and people would get sick from that, then trust in vaccines in general would go down, and would see a resurgence of vaccine preventable disease globally, terrible consequences. It's in everybody's interest to ensure that we have a safe vaccine. It's in everybody's interest that we be honest about what we know and what we don't yet know about vaccine safety, about what can we know about rare events, and how do we go about tracking for rare adverse events. And I'll say that in 1996, there was a vaccine called RotaShield against the diarrheal disease condition called rotavirus that was released, and it caused a number of children to develop a complication, a serious complication, and the vaccine as a result of that was withdrawn within a year of its release into the market. That was a success in the sense that the post-licensure surveillance detected a problem. It then withdrew the vaccine. Okay, this is not the system failing, this is the system succeeding. However, when it comes to considering the risks versus benefits balance that one has to take, a trade-off that one has to make with regards to all decisions, there's nothing that's free of risk. You have to weigh up the risks. Then in the United States, where very few children die of diarrhea, having a few children develop this complication, so-called intussusception, it's a complication of the bowel, is really bad, and you don't want to take that risk. But in the 9 or 10 years that it took until safer vaccines came out, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children died of diarrheal disease all over the world for lack of a vaccine. And would it be appropriate to withhold a vaccine that has some side effects in the context where disease and death rates are very high? I would argue that perhaps not. But then if you were to go ahead and make that argument and say, well, you know what, death rates in Malawi, let's say, are very high from diarrheal disease, we're willing to tolerate some degree of side effect for the saving of the many lives that we could save with this vaccine, then the population might say to you, oh, you're giving us a vaccine that's not good enough to give in the United States. You wouldn't risk American children, but you would risk Malawian children or Sri Lankan children or Indonesian children or Ghanaian children. And that's a strong argument also. So this question of contextualizing the pragmatics of ethics, okay, the idea that we have to not only think about ethical principles, but think about the pragmatics, halacha l'maaseh on the ground, what does it mean? That's a really difficult challenge to understand how to quantify, how to communicate, how to discuss, and how to act, because it comes on the back of other expectations, post-colonialism and other extractive science and so on. So one has to really think about the political implications, the social stigma implications, and so on. Even if one wants to really go there and save lives and do all of that kind of stuff that sounds good, one has to not just sound good, one has to do good. And it's really important to think very carefully and collaboratively and listen to what people's concerns are. So it's just another example of real life stuff, real life ethical dilemmas. Let me talk briefly about variants, and then I think I'll probably have to stop. So there are lots of variants. Again, we heard before about how, marabu ma'asecha, and, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Meshane Abrios, and he's certainly Meshane these, unfortunately for us, these viruses are a living thing, and they're diverse and they multiply and they mutate, as all living things do, as all of biology does. And that's normal and that's fine. The question is, when is a variant of concern? What makes a variant concerning? And there are basically 5 things. The first is that a variant might somehow increase transmissibility. And again, we heard about the binding to the ACE receptor and how SARS-CoV-2 has really strong affinity to the ACE receptor. Well, the UK variant, B117, has even more. And so the same with the Brazil variant, has even more affinity to the ACE receptor. That makes it inherently more transmissible, okay? And that's a problem because we have to raise the bar of all of our other things in order to prevent. We had to do social distancing and masking and now vaccine and everything else that we can do to prevent transmission for a virus that has a given level of transmissibility. If you raise the level of transmissibility, then our compliance with those measures has to increase concomitantly in order to protect us. And that's always been a very difficult thing to achieve. And it's a thing that comes at a cost. It's not lockdowns forever. That lockdowns have a price. They have a price in human life. They have a price in economic life. They have a price in family, in Torah learning, in every regard of life, in childhood development, and nutrition, and so on. So these are trade-offs. They're very, very difficult trade-offs. And to have a one-eyed view of the benefit for containment without thinking about the consequences of our actions in terms of other domains is wrong-headed. You have to make the right decision in the basis of a fair degree of uncertainty with a varying opinion in the public and guide between the least worst option. We don't want unmitigated, unfettered transmission in the community, and that's made worse by these new variants. But we also don't want to we don't want the treatment to be worse than the disease, kivyachol. We want to treat the population like you would a patient. You don't treat the disease, you treat the person. The person has a disease, you treat the person with the disease. The same thing in a population. We have to weigh up all of the issues, not just think only, we cured the disease, but the patient died. We don't want that kind of outcome, okay? So transmissibility. So a variant that has increased transmissibility challenges us even more about these issues that are already so challenging. The second issue, pathogenicity. Does the vaccine result in worse outcomes? Given infection, am I more likely to have a severe disease or death, hospitalization, and so on? The third one, immune escape. If I've been infected, last Purim or last Pesach by garden variety vanilla flavored COVID, am I now going to be coming across the Brazil variant or the South African variant and have another bout of COVID? And if I do, will I be symptomatic or asymptomatic? And if I'm asymptomatic, will I still be transmitting to others, and so on? And if I escape natural immune mechanisms, what about vaccination? Do I escape vaccine? Do I escape therapeutics, monoclonal therapeutics or plasma? Somebody on the chat asked, does the dose of anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in the plasma matter? Yes, they do, but not just the dose, also the specificity. If I've got plasma from the last wave, and now the new wave is a different variant which has immune escape, then the plasma from then may not be as helpful as it used to be. So these are really important issues to keep track of and to adjust our approaches to. So I said transmissibility, pathogenicity, immune escape, therapeutic escape, and the last one, which is not widely talked about, is diagnostic escape. If I've got a PCR test which is based on picking up a certain determinant in the genetic code and determining its presence through PCR, and I've got enough of a shift in my genetic code that my test doesn't detect it, then I'm going to have widespread infection out there, but it'll be test negative. I'll get false negatives. And then I won't detect the variant arriving until it's well established and I've suddenly realized, oh my goodness, I'm missing here something. So they'll be late under ascertainment and late discovery. So that's something that's not yet widely appreciated in the general public, although certainly in scientific circles at the WHO and others, it's a major headache, and people are working very, very hard on all of these issues to really get on top of them and get ahead of the virus. The bottom line is we will never get ahead of the virus. The virus is much cleverer than us. We are the field of action of the virus. We are the environment for the virus. The virus just does what it's supposed to do. The Midrash says, Bria ktana yeshli ba'olam, when it talks about the little yatush that went into the ear. But, here we can borrow that term and say, this is nature doing what it does, and we should be humble in the face of it, but we should do our very best to try to stay ahead of it as much as we can. So I'm not going to go too much into the variants, but there's a really good website called covariance.org. You can go there and you can learn everything you'd like about covariance. So let me sum up. We've gone quickly through many, many issues. I want to talk about ethics and public policy, and with that, maybe to close off. There was a question about herd protection. Is herd protection achievable? Is eradication even achievable? Is elimination achievable? Eradication means no more virus in the world. Elimination means very, very much curtailed transmission globally. Could herd protection be achieved locally, like say in a closed community? So let me address that issue. As I say, at the moment, there's not a lot of strong evidence that immunity against the virus reduces very dramatically at least, transmission, onward transmission. Onward transmission is still possible from asymptomatic persons, as we've always known, but even in persons who are protected either through natural infection or from vaccination to disease, there is still an opportunity for them to continue transmitting. Given that that's the case, now it's less than in a naive person who gets the virus for the first time and they're shedding very, very high numbers of virus. So it's reduced compared to that situation, but it's still possible. Given that that's the case, and given also the fact that coverage with vaccine is going to take time because it's a massive undertaking to vaccinate enough people, and you have to vaccinate the transmitters who themselves may not be persons at high risk. Let's say young people are transmitting, but they may not themselves be at risk of disease. So their vaccine uptake, their desire for vaccine, their demand for vaccine might be low. We're going to have to achieve very high rates of coverage in order to achieve herd protection. And even then, we might not achieve herd protection. So I think this question of herd protection is not yet an achievable target. It may not ever be an achievable target. And we are going to have to maintain all the multiple things that we do in order to curtail transmission for a while yet. Hopefully we'll be able to get at it eventually, but it will be a challenge for some length of time. In a closed community, let's say where there was high rates of infection, I suppose in theory it's possible, but even in the communities that have, where the perception is, we've all had it, we all had it last Pesach, we all had it last Purim, we all have our behind the screen massive weddings and so on. I'm being a little bit, giving an akitza here, but yes, there's been widespread transmission. Lo aleinu, we've seen a lot of death and disease in our community. Still, in those communities where we've done serology, we see that there's a large minority, perhaps close to half, that are still vulnerable. We don't want to put them at risk. We don't want them to lo aleinu, die in another wave of transmission. So I think it's on us to go lechumrah on these issues. You're talking about people's lives. So there's no room here to be lax or makel on these issues. Bearing in mind that if you're too machmir, you also can cause harm in other regards. So you have to make a wise decision. But the fundamental principle is we haven't achieved herd protection. And even if we have, we're now seeing waves of new infection with the variants. So that changes the scenario as well. Okay, briefly about ethics in vaccine distribution. So there is a framework published by the National Institutes of Medicine about distribution within the United States. It's an interesting read. It would be interesting to look at it from a Torah perspective. But certainly, within the United States, there is a sense that the people who are putting themselves at risk for others, health workers and so on, and of course, people who themselves are at risk of adverse outcomes and death, should be prioritized. And we've talked about also that the vaccine is designed for that purpose, really. Second to that would be other groups in decreasing order of risk and transmission. And that's fundamentally the case. Now, globally, the United States taxpayer, your money, has gone very heavily into the development of these vaccines. There's been billions and billions of dollars invested into Operation Warp Speed. That's why we are where we are. It also means that the vaccines come to the United States user at a lower cost because there was already sunk costs initially through tax. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do, right? The fact that we've prepaid means that now when we get the vaccine, our government or our insurer pays less than it did before. But at the same time, we also don't want to price out the rest of the world for two reasons. Number one, because of an argument of justice. And number two, because it's not in our self-interest to have widespread disease everywhere except the borders of the United States, because clearly the virus doesn't respect the borders. So there are global efforts through the mechanism called COVAX, run by both CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, jointly with the World Health Organization, jointly with Gavi, the Vaccine Fund, to make vaccines available by the end of this year to at least 20% of the world's population in every country, and then by 2022 to others. The whole issue around procurement and rollout is very massive and complicated and difficult pragmatic issues to manage. The WHO has done a remarkably good job in developing guidance for countries around those issues, but still the proof is in the pudding of actually getting it out there to people and getting it in their arms. And that's the biggest challenge. In a way, it's much more difficult to do that than it was to even develop the vaccines in the first place. Okay, I'm nearly finished. Yeah. Is
there any way you could just wrap up in the next few minutes so we can move on to the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've already covered pretty much everything else. Somebody asked me a question, when you're uncertain, isn't Shev Al Taisa better? Isn't it better to just not act? And I think I've addressed a lot of these themes already. I think uncertainty isn't part of the fabric. It is the fabric. We never know. Science doesn't know. All we know is what we don't know. we can tell how uncertain we are. So wisdom is about acting in the face of uncertainty. And the right way to act ethically is to make trade-offs that are mindful of what the ultimate reality is on the ground. It's not to function according to principles, it's to function according to outcomes. And if we understand what our decisions, what the consequences of our decisions are, then we can navigate through a whole minefield of challenges to achieve the best possible outcome. And that, I would argue at least, is the right ethical approach to take. Okay, I'll finish there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bar-Zeev, for joining us and sharing your perspectives with us. My name is Liba Weiss, and I'm a board member of the Medical Ethics Society. For this portion of the conference, we will now be holding a Q&A for our two presenters. We are very grateful to have Dr. Elisa Minkin join us to moderate this panel discussion. Dr. Minkin is a practicing pediatrician in Oceanside, New York. She attended Johns Hopkins University, followed by NYU School of Medicine, and completed her internship and residency at Brookdale University Hospital and Medical Center. Dr. Minkin is also highly involved in JOMA, the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. She serves as chair of JOMA's Preventative Health Committee. She produces its hotline, and she is also host of the JOMA podcast, which provides health education to the Orthodox community. Notably, she has worked on numerous COVID-19 and vaccine-related community health efforts in the past, including the MS Vaccine Task Force. So without further ado, Dr. Minkin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be here. And I appreciate so much the amazing talks given by Dr. Bar-Zeev and Dr. Horowitz. So thank you so much. We have a lot of questions and I don't think a lot of time. I'd like to start with a segue from the last thing Dr. Bar-Zeev said, which is about ethics in vaccines. I have one question that is, should you take the vaccine if you were not eligible yet, but you were able to get an appointment? And this would be for Dr. Bar-Zeev, please. I see no from Dr. Harvard.
Look, there are different, let me say it like this. In Israel, there was a prioritization to reach the elderly and people with comorbidities. And at the end of the day, when all of the people who could come for the day's vaccination came, then any residual leftover doses were given to people who weren't in that eligibility. And that allowed the rollout at community level to be very fast and very efficient. It was possible to do that in Israel because of the Kupat Cholim system. People have local health centers that they attend. There's a known catchment area and so on. The United States is a much more complicated field. It's a much more complicated place. The medical system is much more complicated. Issues around justice dominate the discourse a lot more. Whereas in Israel, issues around collectivity dominate the discourse a lot more. So in the United States, there were some ridiculous situations where at the end of a day, a doctor had residual doses. He was driving around his community looking for who to vaccinate. And in the end of the day, he gave one dose to somebody who didn't fall under that. And he got deregistered. And so, I mean, the pendulum can swing far in either direction. So I think one has to be mindful that we just have to take a nice, moderate, centrist, but commonsensical approach. We should prioritize who we can prioritize, but we should not allow wastage, and we should be as efficient as we can. How to achieve those things is an interesting and important question that depends on local context. And beyond that, I think anything that's foisted from above in terms of principle ends up with strange outcomes like the arrest of a doctor who's just trying to do his best.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Horowitz. I'm going to combine two questions that people recently asked. They asked why we wouldn't be, actually it's one question, but I'm going to ask one of mine that I've heard from other people is, why wouldn't hydroxychloroquine work? Why don't we use therapeutics rather than the vaccine? You showed that the hydroxychloroquine is involved in entering into the cell. And someone also asked, why don't we use ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, since also that's another mechanism.
Yeah, I think I can answer both questions with the same answer, and that's therapeutic index or selective toxicity. That's the concept I was mentioning before, is that just because something theoretically works on my slide doesn't mean that it works in people. So all of those interventions have a natural target in you. And if you give them to you, even if you don't have the virus, they will make you sick. You know, they can help you or they can make you sick. So, you know, you have to do they could work theoretically, but doesn't mean they're gonna really work in you without being dangerous. And by the way, I'm Dr. Bar-Zeev did an unbelievable job. And I will say I spent a lot of my career in vaccines, and, you know, they really are the most, you know, efficacious, cost-effective, you know, healthcare dollar you can spend. You know, we spend pennies to vaccinate children against polio all over the world. So, you know, vaccines are against an infectious disease very frequently preferable unless they're dangerous. You know, certain vaccines have, you know, are not that safe. So we're always trying to find the balance between, you know, efficacy and safety. And in vaccines, the bar is very high because you're vaccinating healthy people. So that's what we're faced with this panoply of interventions that we have available.
Thank you. So another hot topic right now is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that just recently got an EUA, and a number of people had questions about that. How does it compare to the mRNA vaccines, which are the Moderna and Pfizer, and should you pick one over the other? And this would be for Dr. Bar-Zeev, please.
So the simple answer is that you can't make straightforward comparisons between efficacy results across trials, particularly trials that were international and conducted in different populations in whom there were different variants circulating at the time. But in addition, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine actually had a slightly higher bar in their outcome. It wasn't any symptomatic COVID, it was moderate to severe COVID. So the fact that they had a higher bar and therefore cleared slightly at a lower rate, I don't think is much of a muchness. The bottom line of all of these vaccines, and this is true for all of them, is that they are all highly protective against COVID hospitalization and COVID death. And that's the key issue, even in the face of variants. Now, there are some variants that have emerged that have immune escape to some degree, but still, even if the titers are lower and so on, and we can they have measurable difference in laboratory parameters, we still are finding at the moment clinical protection and efficacy against the severest outcomes. So there's certainly not a reason to not receive any of the vaccines. You should receive the vaccine that's most available to you in the quickest quick shrift and get it over and done with. That's what I would say.
Thank you. You know, a lot of people have questions about these vaccines. They want to know exactly how they work because they are both different than previous vaccines we've used. So this person asked, which cells do they target? Which cells become the main producers of the virus spike protein? And to compare the J&J to the Moderna and Pfizer. So they really want to know the mechanism. I find a lot of people are asking this. They want to know, does it affect our DNA? You know, does it integrate into our cells? Does it change our genetics?
So the cells are, the vaccines are injected into the arm into the deltoid muscle in the arm, and the muscle cells, the vaccine enters the muscle cells. In the case of the mRNA vaccine, it enters the cytosol, the outside of the nucleus, into the cell, enters the cell itself, and uses the ribosomal system, the system for translation of RNA into protein, to produce a copy of the antigen that would normally be on the virus, but here it's produced by the cell itself. The adenovirus vectored vaccines, the adenovirus is basically a common cold virus that is designed to be non-replicative, so it can't replicate. But it does transfect the cell. By transfect, I mean that it uses the mechanism to enter the cell as it would in a normal infection, but it then stops. It can't go any further than that. And it delivers a payload, which goes, in this case, into the nucleus and uses the mechanisms in the nucleus to achieve essentially exactly the same things that the RNA produces. It doesn't get incorporated, neither vaccine gets incorporated into the human genome. I should say that a very, very large proportion of the human genome is made up of historically residual viruses from millions of years of evolution. So fundamentally, that is common, and the so-called retrovirus group of family are very widespread. The most famous of them is, of course, HIV, but even non-HIV and non-pathologic viruses, there are many viruses out there that are retroviruses and in natural infection can incorporate themselves into human DNA. But that's not true neither for the adenovirus vector nor for coronavirus, as we heard, I think, implied in passing Dr. Horowitz's lecture. So they do not get incorporated into the human genome. They don't change the human genome. They certainly don't change the germline. We're not all morphs of virus and humanity and that kind of stuff. That's just not the case. Those myocytes that get infected, transfected by the adenovirus vector, or that the mRNA inserts into, present on their surface molecules the antigen, and then through just the usual mechanisms of immune surveillance, B cells and T cells get activated, and then they do what they do in the local regional lymphatics, in the lymph nodes, and so on. That does have some implication because there is some people who get nodal enlargement, and there's been some questions around people who need to have nodal surveillance, let's say for breast cancer and so on, that perhaps they should have, there's some questions about whether they should have their usual surveillance before receiving the vaccine. Certainly these vaccines do not cause cancer. They don't cause a worsening of lymphatic enlargement from malignancy, but they may cause low levels of lymphatic enlargement that could confound the normal surveillance. Because if I'm looking, you go to the doctor and when you have a cold and they do this and they feel your lymph glands. Anytime you have infection, there's immune activation. So if monitoring of those things is important, then you should have them monitored to discuss with your oncologist. But the vaccines themselves don't cause harm to the body. In fact, in the case of the RNA vaccines, one of the challenges, it's such a fragile molecule, it breaks down so quickly, it's been very challenging to be able to produce a vaccine that works. So they don't last, they don't hang around, they don't cause toxic effects. Thank you.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Horowitz. Some people have asked, are the antibodies that people make naturally from infection different from those from the vaccine? And should people who have antibodies, can they behave differently? Should they be behaving differently than those who have antibodies from the vaccine?
So a lot of people, a lot of labs, including ours, have been following this question and we're bringing back the original convalescent patients. So we're now going on a year for those people. And we're also looking at the characterizing the antibodies in people who have received both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. I'm not sure if we have any J&J people yet, but amazingly, not amazingly, I guess, they really, well, these vaccines are very good and the antibodies really the antibody responses look strikingly similar. And that's in part just an interesting scientific question. One of the ways we got very lucky and probably why the vaccines work so well is that the antibody response that we produce is the antibodies don't seem to need to mutate very much in our bodies in order to work well against this particular virus. So those germline antibodies that our B cells have, what we're born with, like I said, the original repertoire that you're born with, are pretty, not so far away. It doesn't take a lot of cycling through your lymph nodes to make really good antibodies against this virus. And the vaccines, apparently, this S protein that are made by the vaccines that your muscle cells make from the vaccines, it really looks like it's enough. I mean, I've worked in vaccines most of my life. These are among the most efficacious vaccines I'm aware of. So the first answer is they're very similar. And what was the second question was?
Well, it was about antibodies that are derived from the illness versus antibodies derived from the vaccine.
Oh, well, that they're similar. They're similar. There really is not. The question was about behavior, I think. So what we are thinking is that until we get a better handle on, the virus, we really have to be behaving. And I think Dr. Bar-Zeev really said this, very similarly. We should still be masking. We should still be staying, not gathering indoors. Still be limiting the duration of our contact with people because, we're gathering this data in real time. A year ago, we thought maybe we don't even need masks. We don't know until we gather the data. We can't certain things we know about viral behavior, but we still have to gather data, and it'll take some time. So until then, let's not do anything risky because, as I said, these variants will evolve, a zillion times faster if there's a lot of virus around. That's just math. So we should not put ourselves at risk until we have a better feeling on, transmissibility and, how immune we are. And again, as Dr. Bar-Zeev said, because it's an emergency, we're really only looking at hospitalization and death for all of these products. The other stuff, we're looking at it, but it'll just take more time. We just don't know yet.
Right. And a common question, I'm going to segue right off that is, well, then what can we do once we've had the vaccine? A lot of people ask, well, now can I get together with my grandchildren?
Yeah, I'm in that position too. So, yeah, I think you know, we should, I would say we should still be cautious, but certainly, you know, we can get, I would say, you know, you can see small number of people indoors, you know, much more easily than you could have before. But I'm not going to see anybody indoors, you know, that hasn't been vaccinated or been ill recently with COVID.
Thank you.
I should say it also depends on who you're, you know, like we're going to have a new grandchild in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. That baby's not making any antibodies till it's at least 6 weeks old. So the potential outcome of that is horrific, right? So we have to be extremely careful. It's not the same as, you know, it depends on your goal, your personal goals also, I would say.
Right. We have so many questions and we have no more time. I just did want to have 1 minute to have Dr. Bar-Zeev also answer that question, because I think that is the most common question, is what can we do once we've been vaccinated? I'm going to read a specific question. Is it safe for grandparents who are vaccinated to visit and sleep over at home with children and grandchildren who have antibodies to COVID, or what if they don't have antibodies? Now, nobody can answer these specific questions. I just really want a quick gestalt approach from Dr. Bar-Zeev.
I agree with Dr. Horowitz. And I'd like to answer this question at 2 levels. There's the question of public policy, and there's the question of what you should do in your family. And from a public policy point of view, we should not rely on the vaccines to reduce transmission and infection. We should maintain all of the general public policy that has been maintained up until now. However, when it comes to individual decision-making, you have to do, like I said, with everything, trade-offs. If your 97-year-old great-grandmother hasn't seen people and she's on her last few months and there's no point in her living unless she has a hug, then give her a hug, for heaven's sake. You know, be sensible, have common sense. If she's vaccinated, if you're vaccinated, you're both protected from disease, and that's the most important thing. At a population level, should we be encouraging large sedarim and everybody getting together and mixing and matching across different michzas nefashot when it comes to the Korban Pesach? No. But you know, at a given personal situation, of course, you have to weigh up your own risks and balances. As Dr. Horowitz says, you can personalize decision-making, and vaccine lowers the bar. We can breathe a sigh of relief. But we shouldn't crowd, and we should still wear masks if we can, and so on. But we have to be sensible as well. We can't just be single, you know, see this from one side and not the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate this opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Mencken, for moderating that enlightening discussion. I just want to let the audience know that we're aware that we're behind schedule. I will continue the conference beyond 1 p.m. to allow all speakers their allotted time. My name is Yisrael Danesh, and I'm a vice president of the Yeshiva University Medical Ethics Society. Over the past year, we have heard incredible stories of heroism from across the country. Frontline workers have put themselves at risk every single day to fight COVID-19 and treat the millions of people infected. The immense sacrifice and bravery has been truly inspiring. We don't have to look far to find noteworthy individuals who have made many of these sacrifices. Today, we are honored to be joined by 2 physicians who will be sharing their stories. We'll first hear from Dr. Eli Bennett. Dr. Bennett divides his time working as a full-time attending physician in the emergency room at New York Presbyterian Queens Flushing Hospital and at his internal medicine practice. Dr. Bennett earned his MD at New York Medical College and is double board certified, having completed residencies at New York Hospital Queens in both internal medicine and emergency medicine. Dr. Bennett has spent the last year at the forefront of the battle against COVID-19, treating patients both in the ER and in his practice. Dr. Bennett, the floor is all yours.
Can't get the video on. Hi, there we go. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am humbled and privileged to be speaking with all of you today. It is an undeniable fact that medical professionals make the absolute worst patients. After my experiences over the past year, there's no question that I should have been forced to seek counseling services. Looking over my emails and text messages from the last 12 months has been a sort of therapy for me. I'm still way too stubborn to go see a professional, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my story. Some of my favorite books are when the author takes the same story and shows it from different vantage points. Obviously, no people have had the same exact experiences during this pandemic, but the storylines have been similar. The changes to routine daily life, uncertainty, followed by fear of the unknown, hopelessness, and feelings that this is never going to end. And my favorite part, heroism. Tuesday, March 10th, 2020 was an important date. It was Purim, but it was also the first documented case of COVID-19 in my hospital, New York Presbyterian in Queens. NYPQ is a community hospital. Although it is not as renowned as our parent hospitals, Cornell or Columbia Presbyterian, it is still a level 1 trauma center. And with 530 beds, is one of the largest hospitals in Queens. It also has the distinction of being one of the worst hit hospitals early in this pandemic, as New York City itself was the initial epicenter of COVID-19 in the US, and Queens was hit the hardest. In the weeks leading up to March 10th, we started making initial preparations while stocking up on masks and gloves and other PPE, all the while reading the news out of China and then Italy. But I'm going to be very honest with you. We miscalculated badly. We never dreamed that what was happening in Italy could happen by us. Call it denial. Perhaps it was hubris to think that we were so much better than these other countries. I mean, come on. We have 5G on airplanes, and nobody makes better TikToks than the good old US of A. There was no chance that it was making its way over here, and even if it did, we'd have no problem taking care of it. Those Italians are just not as medically advanced as we are. But there we were on March 10th with our first case in Queens. By Friday, March 13th, we had 20 patients admitted with hypoxemia, very low oxygen levels. We then just started to get an inkling of how contagious this coronavirus might be. I spent that morning on Friday on the phone with various doctors in and out of New York, trying to come up with a game plan. I then went door to door to the rabbis from Kew Garden Hills, my community, discussing the need to start doing the unthinkable. Shut down our shuls, start having all of our prayers outside. Let's also begin to implement this newfangled idea called social distancing. There was some minor resistance, but to their credit, the overwhelming majority of the rabbis listened. Shabbos that week was surreal. I just remember the sun shining and everyone milling around outside discussing the new measures. For me, the weekend had a strange undercurrent as I was on call from my emergency room if somehow it became necessary to get extra help. Thank God they didn't need it. Saturday night, the picture was a little bleaker, but very manageable. At this point, my cell phone was still fairly quiet. The general population had no idea of the tidal wave that was about to hit. Over the next few days, everyone started hearing the sirens all day and all night. Hatzalah transporting the sick to the hospital. My cell phone started buzzing. Text messages, phone calls, WhatsApps. Everyone thought I knew something that wasn't in the news. On March 23rd, I wrote one of my many emails to my neighborhood. I wrote, I am writing with a sobering update. When I emailed you all 5 days ago, there were 50 people admitted to my hospital with confirmed pneumonia and low oxygen. There are now well over 200. The sick include a friend who is a healthcare worker who went into cardiac arrest over the weekend. He ultimately died. Many others, your neighbors, are among the patients with pneumonia and respiratory distress, friends who are admitted to the hospital and barely hanging on. Hundreds more in our neighborhood have tested positive but are not sick enough to require hospitalization. Unless you all think it's only old people, this week we intubated a 36-year-old who had pneumonia so bad on his x-ray that I usually only see this kind of x-ray on drowning victims. And yes, that's what they all look like, pneumonia all over the lungs. Essentially, we're crossing our fingers and hoping we can keep people alive long enough to get better on their own. The rest of the email was essentially me begging people to stay home. On March 29th, Shomrei Hadass Funeral Home in Brooklyn sent out a plea for help, asking for anyone with a minivan to help transport the dead. The link included a video showing wrapped up bodies stacked in the morgue, the chapel, and even the hallways. That afternoon, I received a text message from the chaplain at our hospital. It was addressed to our hospital WhatsApp Mincha group. Dear fellow Yidden of NYPQ, we are in unprecedented times, and we are all called by Hashem to do unimaginable things. May Hashem give us the strength to do those things and keep us and our families safe as we do them. Given the current reality, we may unfortunately be present as one of our fellow Jews is dying. So I want to share with you some tefillos that are said with a dying patient. May we never need to, but may Hashem give us the strength to serve him properly. Unfortunately, I refer to that email often over the next few weeks. April 1st, I had a heated phone call with multiple doctors from Queens and Long Island, emergency room doctors, critical care specialists, infectious disease, cardiology, pulmonary, and others were on this call. Tempers flared, voices were raised. We had no idea what we were doing. Exhausted, frustrated, scared, and humbled. A simple viral particle, and we didn't have the slightest idea how to fight it. People were dying every day. We were grasping at straws. Mount Sinai was trying cocktails of different antiviral medications, such as Tamiflu. Northwell was trying steroids. Others were trying antiparasitic drugs like ivermectin or interleukins. Hydroxychloroquine and Zithromax were touted, but subsequently showed no reduction in morbidity or mortality. We were willing to try anything to help. Then we found out that patients with COVID were hypercoagulable. This means that many people developed blood clots. I clearly remember a 29-year-old with a very large pulmonary embolus, a blood clot in his lungs. He died. We shared our successes and failures so that others can learn. Any success might mean saving even one more life. I was asked to give a lecture, and I remember saying at the time, Dr. Fauci is making it up every day, and so are we. It actually took all the way until October 22nd until we finally received the first FDA approval for the treatment of COVID-19, remdesivir. It took that long. Another letter to my community dated April 3rd, barely 3 weeks since our first case. This is Dr. Bennett again. I spent 24 of the last 36 hours in my emergency room. It is an absolute nightmare. I personally intubated 3 patients in just under 1 hour. We have over 400 patients admitted with COVID, 82 of them on ventilators. To put things in perspective, my ER, my emergency room, which is built to hold 80 to 100 patients, had 172 people admitted with COVID, crammed into spots, corners, and crevices. All of our ICU and step-down units usually can handle 50 patients. We already had 82 intubated patients and managing ventilators in the hallways. In 22 years of medicine, I've never seen the staff look this tired, physically and emotionally drained. At least twice an hour, we hear the call overhead that somebody upstairs is in cardiac arrest. This acutely exacerbates our distress. People that we were caring for are dead 12 hours later. 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 70-year-olds. Nobody is spared. We are at the breaking point. We are out of space in our hospital. We are out of space in our emergency room. I was caring for a woman this morning with an oxygen level of 64%, and I had to have her sitting in a chair for an hour until I could find a stretcher. Multiple doctors in the hospital are out sick with the virus. The community has been sending love, food, and supplies. It is a sight to behold, and it does lift our spirits. Continue the davening, continue the prayers. Don't stop for 1 second, but please do it from home. Do it with your children. Have us in mind. We need it. We all need it. Now, I told you before that NYPQ is a 530-bed community hospital with an emergency room designed to handle between 80 and 100 patients. At its peak, we had all 530 beds full with 210 more patients in the ER, as well as other converted spaces, including endoscopy, surgical recovery rooms, and yes, even the hospital cafeteria was converted into COVID holding areas. This scene was played out throughout hospitals in New York, hospitals bursting at the seams and putting patients in any available space. I vividly remember a PA that used to work for me calling me crying from a Brooklyn hospital as she was managing 16 ventilator patients by herself. She was not a critical care ICU physician. She was a great PA, but admitted to me that she was in way over her head and just doing the best she could because there was nobody else to manage these patients. Last night, I Googled, what is the true meaning of heroism? And Google, as always, answered me. Heroism consists of putting others first, even at your own peril. As someone who shows great courage and valor is referred to as a hero, their actions are considered to be acts of heroism. Now, I've never considered being a physician a hero. A firefighter running into a burning building is a hero. A police officer diving into the Hudson River to save a drowning victim is a hero. I was initially embarrassed upon leaving the hospital one night, and there were hundreds of firefighters and police officers outside clapping for us. But it gave us chizuk, encouragement to carry on. There have been many heroes these past 12 months. I have a local dermatologist in my neighborhood, Dr. Fred Pereira, who for many weeks manned a New York City COVID hotline to answer questions from scared strangers. He couldn't be in the emergency room, but he put others first. He is a hero. All elective cases for surgery in the hospital were canceled. We had orthopedists, vascular surgeons, and other subspecialties who all came down to the emergency room to assist us. They are heroes. Pharmacists, nurses, techs, secretaries, transporters, radiology technicians, EMTs, paramedics, the list goes on. Countless heroes, not just putting their lives on the line, but their lives on hold. I know of multiple Hatzalah members sleeping in the basement of their homes, staying away from their family for weeks at a time so as not to infect them if they became ill, all so that they would be available to help our community. They are heroes. Kew Garden Hills raised $50,000 in 4 hours at my mere suggestion that if we buy oxygen concentrators, we can keep the moderately ill at home as opposed to transporting them to the hospital. Within a few short days, we had an entire operation up and running, with oxygen being delivered to people's homes on Pesach, on Shabbos. Patients were given pulse oximeters, and even 24/7 telemedicine was made available. I am certain we saved a number of lives through this program. I would be remiss if I didn't publicly thank Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glatt, not for glory, nor fame, nor money. He made himself available to me with any questions I had so that I could help guide my community. He stuck out his neck, giving the best advice he could with the information available at the time. He is a hero and should be blessed with many more years to help Klal Yisrael. Early May and June, we started to have some hope. Community awareness coupled with social distancing helped flatten the curve. The number of admissions and deaths trended downward. We heard less sirens in the street. In the hospital, we learned that putting people on respirators, although often a mainstay for respiratory distress, actually increased mortality in COVID patients. Proning, laying people on their stomachs, and high flow oxygen seemed to save lives. We were finally able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Although we experienced a second wave in September, at least here in New York, we were better prepared. The community was better educated, and it wasn't as devastating as those initial weeks in March and April. I'm going to end off with my last letter that I sent to my community, dated May 7th. Welcome to our new world. I truly believe we have turned a corner here in New York. Hospital admissions are down, and the number of deaths are declining each day. I wish I could unsee many events from the last few weeks. I've watched 30-year-olds come to my emergency room and die within hours. I've said vidoy, confession, with virtual strangers and watched them struggle with their last breath. all alone with nobody at the bedside other than myself. I've witnessed friends and neighbors die while helplessly looking on. We have buried the best of our community. I've had episodes of soul-sucking crying, enough times that my family and office staff were worried that I was having an emotional breakdown. I've also seen amazing things. Communities have come together to arrange food deliveries for people unable to get out. We've delivered oxygen to those sickest of patients and allowed them to stay home and survive. Hatzalah, Shomrim, and other organizations have stepped up and met the challenge head on. I am privileged to be part of the medical community that has persevered despite emotional and physical hurdles. March 10th, 2020, until today, March 7th, 2021, 1 year later. The world has changed and it's never going back to exactly the way it was. Over 2.5 million people have died worldwide from COVID-19. We forget how scared we were, and we forget how little we knew. But as my grandfather always said, the Eibishter fear the Welt. Hashem runs the world. We should all continue to have the strength to be his messengers, to be a beacon of light for others, to always be on the giving end. And in that zechus, we should all be healthy, and Hashem should help bring Mashiach soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett, for sharing your personal experiences with us and for all of your hard work over the past year. Our next speaker is Dr. Alan Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is an attending physician at Houston Methodist Hospital and Baylor St. Luke's Hospital in Houston, Texas, as well as a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He graduated from Baylor College of Medicine and has been practicing medicine for over 30 years. Recently, Dr. Hoffman helped organize an emergency distribution of vaccines during the storm in Houston 3 weeks ago, showing immense leadership and initiative and making a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. 2 of his 4 sons recently graduated from Yeshiva University, and I'm proud to call him my father-in-law. Without further ado, Dr. Hoffman.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Are you able to, oh, there you go. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamara. Thank you, David and YU for allowing me to participate. I would like to say that after the last speaker, that's a hard act to follow. So let me set the stage for you. On February 15th, President's Day, Houston, Texas, which has a subtropical climate, had a historic Arctic cold wave come through the city. And the city was covered in a layer of ice. Most of the homes were without power. The phone service and data were not available for a lot of us. And the city was basically not working. At 9:30 that morning, and it was a Monday morning, I was ending my morning hospital rounds. I got a call from one of the heads of the hospital, Methodist Hospital, Roberta Schwartz, and she told me that there were several hundred COVID vaccines, Moderna vaccines that needed to be given right away. Later, I found out that there was a problem with the refrigeration at the county facility, so the vaccines had to be given. I was asked, can I organize and administer a pop-up clinic with hundreds of vaccines and give those vaccines in 2.5 hours? It was 9:30 a.m. and the vaccines had to be in arms by noon. Can I get these vaccines into the arms? Pick a place, they said. For example, the shul, because there many people live within walking distance, and because the city, the roads were not very drivable. So the state of Texas has requirements for those who are permitted and recommended to get the vaccine, but we didn't have the luxury of time to make a sign-up sheet to triage the people beforehand. We didn't even know how many people would show up. So our mandate was to get vaccine into arms in 2.5 hours in inclement weather. We couldn't expect the old and infirm to drive or walk in the icy weather, and we didn't know how to get them to the site. So we decided to give the vaccine first come, first serve. I spoke with Rabbi Gelman, the rabbi of United Orthodox Synagogue, my rabbi, who opened the shul to this event and who was instrumental in helping us with this pop-up vaccine clinic. I spoke with several doctors in the community, asked them to come to the shul to help me organize and give the vaccines. They helped spread the word to other healthcare professionals, nurses, nurse practitioners, and lay people who walked to the shul to help us set up. I spoke with representatives from our shul, from our local day school, the Robert M. Barron Academy, and other shuls, telling them that we had a vaccine event. And a few well-connected people on my call list were notified and asked to get the word out. I was given the vaccine, about 300 doses and supplies at about 10:30 a.m. and arrived at the shul around 10:45 a.m. There were several hundred people waiting outside the shul, outside the social hall in 15-degree weather. The shul social hall was set up. There was a reception table in the lobby, and in the social hall, there were several stations for vaccines, and as well as a large rest observation site and an area to draw up the vaccines. Each station was manned by a vaccinator, either a doctor or nurse, and a scribe, usually a layperson. And we had runners to take supplies, vaccines to each station. The president of the shul and others checked people in. The vaccine recipients were directed to vaccine stations, and Rabbi Gelman, amongst his other responsibilities, managed the crowd with his wit and humor and helped pull older people out to put ahead in line. Once we were up and running smoothly and saw that we had more people than vaccines, we asked for more. A shul member went to the hospital to pick up 50 more doses. Thanks to the organizational skills of our community at United Orthodox Synagogue, their professionalism, experience, and I might add, lack of ego, our team was able to give 360 doses in our pop-up clinic in just 2.5 hours. The next morning, we got another call from the hospital offering us 220 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. And this time, we had no electricity in the shul. We were able to replicate our vaccine clinic and gave an additional 220 doses, so a total of in 2 hours. So for the 2 days, in the 2 days, we gave 580 doses. Our only disappointment was that we could have given more had we had more vaccine. And I'm going to add that the vaccine recipients were from a broad and diverse representation of Houston, not just Jews, but there were Christians and Muslims, probably Buddhists. We had Asian Americans and African Americans and Hispanics. The whole broad, diverse base of Houston was there and got their vaccines. What's amazing and rewarding and fulfilling, many of the vaccine recipients were desperate for a vaccine, but were not yet on the state's preferred or recommended list. For example, teachers, caregivers for elderly family members, some people with immune diseases. The gratitude and relief of these people was great. It was amazing. Our vaccine clinic staff has been discussing doing this again on the road, perhaps at churches and in underserved neighborhoods. That's our story. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Bennett, for sharing your truly inspirational stories. My name is Avishai Samua, and I'm a board member of the YU Medical Ethics Society. The spread of COVID-19 throughout the world quickly posed many medical ethics questions in the realm of halacha. Many of these issues were matters of life and death, and expert authorities were consulted to help find resolutions. These questions were often highly complex and unlike anything our generation has experienced. One of the leaders at the forefront of these discussions is Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg, to whom we are tremendously appreciative for addressing us today from Israel. Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg is the director of the Medical Ethics Unit, a member of the Institutional Review Board, and a senior pediatric neurologist at the Shari Tzedek Medical Center in Jerusalem. He studied at the medical school of the Hebrew University Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. He was trained in pediatrics at the Shari Tzedek Medical Center in Jerusalem and in pediatric neurology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and the Montefiore Hospital Medical Center. He also served in the Israeli Air Force as a medical officer, reaching the rank of major. Head of the editorial board of the Talmudic Encyclopedia, he is also director of Yad Harav Herzog and a member of national and international societies of child neurology, medical ethics, and Jewish medical ethics. Rabbi Professor Steinberg has just recently published a book on the historical, medical, and halachic perspectives on the coronavirus pandemic, and we have attached a link in the chat for anyone who is interested. Following his discussion, we'll be holding a Q&A moderated by the David Mitzner Dean of the Center of the Jewish Future, Rabbi Yaakov Glasser. It is my great honor to introduce Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg.
Thank you very much for your introduction. May I share my PowerPoint? Okay. So the issues that I'll discuss are primarily the question of triage decisions to save lives when there is a shortage of life-saving measures, the vaccine issue, both the importance of the vaccine and some aspects of triage of vaccinating, and some halachic issues, although in the book that was just now mentioned, you can find many, many more halachic issues that came up during this year, discussed from halachic sources, from experience, and from discussion with some of the poskim. The book is one side in English, the other side in Hebrew, so you can choose the language that is more convenient for you to learn these issues. So before going into some of these complex issues, let me just show you some of the pandemic results. The physical health, including mortality and morbidity, is tremendous. In Israel, there are over 5,700 deaths records and over 780,000 sick people or infected. In the United States, over 510,000 people died and over 28 million people have been infected. And if we look at the world, there are over 2.5 million people who died and over 114 million people infected in over 200 countries. But not only the physical health was jeopardized during this pandemic, there's also a lot of emotional issues, people who are confined, who are locked up, who are quarantined. These created a lot of emotional issues. The economy has suffered tremendously in all countries in the world. Education has suffered because schools, yeshivas, Talmudei Torah, all were either closed or partially closed or open and closed during periods, obviously affecting negatively the ability to teach. And the social aspects, as we are doing it now, usually we meet in conferences, we talk to each other, besides listening to the lecture. And now I'm giving almost twice a day Zoom conferences all over the world without moving from my chair at home, which has an advantage that I'm not wasting time flying and traveling, but the human contact obviously is lacking. So it is bad, but there are some lessons that can be learned from this pandemic. First of all, it is clear that this pandemic has taught humanity modesty and humility. This miniature new virus that to this point in time, despite the year long of the pandemic, we still are being surprised almost daily with what it can do, has put the science world, the doctors, nurses, and healthcare providers, as well as healthcare policymakers, to feel modest and feel another that really we know very little, despite the fact that we are in the 21st century. Interesting to note that the last historic worldwide pandemic, the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1917-18, created a worldwide pandemic. And in the leading journal, even then, which is today still existing, the Science Journal, in 1918, there was an article published summarizing the pandemic of the Spanish influenza. And actually, you could just remove the date and instead of 1918, put 2018 or 2021, and almost identically, you'll find the descriptions then and today. So 100 years did not change much, despite the fact that medicine and science has advanced so much. So virology and these particular viruses are still with us and causing the same damage as they did 100 years ago. For observant Jews, there are two important lessons that we should take with us from this pandemic. One is the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the creator of the world, that his presence and strength has been again shown to the whole world. King David in Tehillim says, how great are your works, or how manifold are your works. We can paraphrase it and say, how small are your works? The little virus, look what it can do to the world when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants it to happen for whatever reason he finds it to be the cause to do it. Another lesson that I think we should take with us is to engage in serious introspection and repentance, both as individuals and as communities. This virus has caused a higher than the average percentage of illness and death in Haredi and communities, both in Israel and in other countries, in the USA, in England, and in other countries. Interestingly to note, unfortunately, that apparently it was the first time in the history of Jewish people that at some point of this pandemic, all institutions of Torah and prayer have been shut down in the entire world. Batei Medrash, shuls, Talmudei Torah, yeshivas were all closed at certain point all over the world. This has never happened because even in the worst historic times, it was bad in one area, but it was okay in another area. Even World War II, which was a terrible situation for Jews, European Jews didn't have these institutions, but at the same time in the United States, in Australia, in Israel, they were functioning. But this time in history, it really closed all over, and I think this is something to look into. So I think it is really an obligation upon all of us, both individuals and communities collectively, to understand that there is no man so wholly righteous on earth that he's always doing good and never sins. The Pasuk uses the phrase man, Adam, which means every man. It can be the greatest Gadol or the simplest Jew. Everyone might have had something doing wrong, and this is a time to look into himself and into his community and try to do better. And I think one of the outstanding evils in Jewish societies is the tremendous machloket within all sects and sections of the Jewish communities, and perhaps even more so within and between observant Jewish communities, leads to hatred, to shaming, and to a machloikes that is really disruptive, and it's not l'shem shamayim. So hopefully people will look into it. Maybe this or maybe other major issues could be corrected. So we hope and pray that our learning and our discussions will remain from now on just theoretical and will go into the path of peace and repentance. So these are some of the lessons that, despite the bad aspects of the pandemic, we can take with us. Now, one of the important messages from the part of, one of the important messages that I want to relate to is the fact that we need to observe almost religiously the directives of the medical authorities and the medical and authorities that put on policies, because halachically we are talking about a situation of pikuach nefesh, and therefore there's a whole host of requirements, of obligations, halachically speaking, that we should follow directives in order to save our own lives, and not less so, and probably more so, to save lives of others that we may infect, and they might be in a greater danger. So we know that v'nishmartem od lenafshotechem means that you have to keep whatever is appropriate, medically speaking, in order to save yourself from diseases. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, if you see someone is doing something that may cause him damage or injury, or he is within the situation, you should help him. There is an issue of roidef. If you are not taking care of yourself and you got infected, you most likely will infect others, some of which might be elderly, might be with background diseases, might be immune suppressed, and by infecting them, you might even kill them, certainly cause them serious disease. And according to the Tosfos, chav le'achrine, if you cause damage to someone else, is even worse than chav le'atzmo, that you do something wrong to yourself. So therefore, we should heed and keep whatever we are said and told that is appropriate to save ourselves and our friends. Interesting that already in the first half of the 19th century, during the second cholera pandemic, as you may know, there were 7 bouts of cholera pandemic during the 18th and 17th centuries. And during the second one, the Godel Hador at that time was Rabbi Kiva Eger, and there are several letters of him describing his rulings, how to behave in those days during the pandemic. And he stressed that everyone should follow the prescription and directions of what physicians are saying, and one should not violate doctor's orders, even a touch. One must observe everyone doctor's orders, whatever they ordered in those days. And violating it is considered to have gravely sinned to God. Therefore, he calls upon everyone to follow what doctors are saying. So there are people who think they are smarter than the experts and they know better, or they rely on a small minority of people who think that they are experts or are experts but are a minority opinion, and that clearly is against halacha. So indeed, most halachic authorities in the Orthodox Jewish population, both in Israel, United States, and England, when they saw the disproportionate amount of infection in Haredi communities and the disproportionate morbidity and mortality, they indeed require that everyone should follow medical experts and health authorities' directives and do whatever is right according to the time when it was initiated, whether it had to do with closing yeshivas, whether it had to do with minyanim outside shul, or even no minyanim. All this during certain waves of the pandemic were ruled by very authoritative rabbis. So now let's start with the first major issue of triaging when there are more patients who need life-saving measures than the measures are available. These are always tragic choices. They are always life and death decisions, because if there is a shortage and I decide to treat patient A, it will go on the expense of patient B, who will not be able to receive the life-saving measure, and he will die. So these are very, very serious and problematic choices to make by physicians. But there are sometimes no other ways other than doing it. And the question is, how do we do it the best way and the right way? So in general, in halacha, there are several rules how to determine preferences when there are conflicts in timing or in availability to fulfill all the mitzvahs that are required at the time. So one rule may be whichever is more common comes first. Tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. And therefore, every morning, we have to put on talis and put on tefillin. We can't do all of them at once. We have to do it in a certain order. So based on tadir v'sheino tadir, we first put the talis and then the tefillin, because talis we put on every day, including Shabbos and Yom Tov, and tefillin we are not using on Shabbos and Yom Tov, so talis is more frequently used, more commonly used, and therefore it takes precedence. Another rule is whichever is holier comes first. Kol hamekudash mechavero kodem et chavero. So if you have to decide between talis and tefillin when you don't have sufficient funds to buy both, then the one that is more holy, the tefillin, takes precedence over the talis, who is less holy in this sphere. Another rule is we escalate in holiness and do not decrease. Ma'alin b'kodesh ve'ein moridin. So if there are two things that we have to decide between them, we should use the ones that will increase holiness and not decrease. Another rule is we do not pass over mitzvahs. Ein ma'avirin ala mitzvahs. So if you have a mitzvah before you, you can't pass it and perform the other mitzvah beyond it, because you have to do first the one that came to your attention. Also, a positive commandment overrides a prohibition, aseh kodem lo taseh, and obviously Torah commandments override rabbinic ones, the right to doche the rabbonon, and whoever is involved already in a mitzvah is exempt from another mitzvah that comes up. So there are rules on how to organize priorities in case of conflict when you can't do all of them at once. Now, actually, there are two different approaches to do different situations when we decide how to preference between two mitzvahs that we can't do at once. When there is a need to perform two or more mitzvahs at the same time, and it is to give preference to one mitzvah over the other due to lack of time to do both of them together. So then the dilemma is, which mitzvah should you perform before another one? But at the end, you will do both mitzvahs, just the order is what we are triaging. But in contrast, there are situations where you can perform only one out of the two or more mitzvahs, but there won't be an ability to perform the other mitzvahs once you performed the one that you preferred. So for instance, if there are not sufficient funds to buy both talis and tefillin, as we said earlier, then from the funding that you have, you will buy the tefillin that are mekudashim, more holy, and you will give up buying altogether the next mitzvah, the talis, because you don't have the funds to do it. So these are two separate decisions, and the end results might be different based on the different criteria on how you preference these two types of mitzvahs. Now, let's turn to our situation. What are the life-saving measures in a pandemic, and not only in a pandemic, that might be short of access, and therefore you'll have to decide who will get it so that the other one who will come or will be negatively triaged will not get it at all. So we're talking about ICU beds, ventilators, ECMO machines, medications, PPEs, and also, very important, medical personnel. There are not always sufficient physicians, nurses, technicians, and so on to take care of so many patients who come at once, and therefore you'll have to triage because you don't have manpower to treat them. So what is a situation that we need to make such decisions? So we are talking about sudden, unanticipated mass casualties of varying physical and emotional trauma within a very short time, where the healthcare system is limited by the ability to fully treat all of them, either because of lack of equipment or limited personnel. And such situations can occur in various, because of various causes, not necessarily a situation of pandemic. So we know that train accidents or airplane accidents or sometimes even car accidents may create traumatized people in a very large number, so that the people who come to save them can't deal with all of them at once. Certainly it may happen in natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, tsunami, tornadoes, and so on. And in war situation, it happens quite frequently. There's only one medical officer, there is a battalion, there are 15 injured soldiers. He can only treat one at a time. Who should he treat first? Who should he neglect altogether? Who should he defer to treat later? It can be also industrial disasters such as fires, explosions, and so on. And obviously pandemics. The corona one that we are facing now is not the first one. There were huge pandemics of pestilence, of cholera. We talked about the Spanish influenza, lately the Ebola, AIDS, and other pandemics that caused the life of many people, and not all of them could have been treated at once. So what are the sources, the halachic sources, regarding the question on how to triage? So there are several of them. I won't go over all of them, but I want to preface the discussion with a letter that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach wrote to a colleague of mine, Dr. Shimon Glick, when he asked him about how to triage halachically in cases of a disaster. And he wrote to him, I can assure you that I am not setting firm guidelines regarding triage questions. They are very grave, and I don't know clear halachic proofs for them. So if Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach didn't know clear halachic proofs, certainly people like myself don't know them to be clear. However, it happens, and we need answers, and we need to decide how to treat people in such situations. And therefore, we are trying to look into sources in order to adjust the right triage decision halachically. So there is a famous Gemara in Bava Metzia regarding two people walking in the desert. One of them has enough water that he possesses to save himself to get out of the desert, but if he will drink the water, save himself, his fellow man who is walking with him will die of dehydration. So what is his obligation to do in such a situation? So Ben Ptura said, it is preferable that both of them drink and die and let neither of them see the death of the other. So although I am the owner of the water, but if I'll drink the full amount of the water and save myself, my fellow will die and I shouldn't do it, so we should divide it. Hopefully, we might be saved, and if not, better both of us die than one should survive and see the death of the other. However, Rabbi Akiva taught, and it says, "V'chai achicha imach, chayecha kodmim lechayei chavercha." Your life takes precedence over the life of the other, and therefore you should drink the water, and even though, unfortunately, your friend will die. There's a big halachic debate according to whom do we paskin. Most paskin according to Rabbi Akiva, but even in the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the question is, does Rabbi Akiva say that the owner of the water is obligated to drink himself because his pikuach nefesh takes preference over his friend, and if he doesn't do so, he is sort of committing suicide, which is forbidden? Or does Rabbi Akiva teach that you are allowed to drink the water despite the fact that your friend will die, but lifnim mishur asadin, if you want to behave not according to the law, you want to be better, then you are allowed to divide the water. These are disputes amongst the poskim. However, this source is irrelevant to what we are discussing in modern days. The reason is that in this source, the life-saving measure belongs to one of the people who is in need of the life-saving measure. That is almost never the case in modern situations. In our case, in a pandemic situation, when 5 patients come and there are only 2 ICU beds, the ICU beds don't belong to either of the 5. They belong to the community, they belong to the country, they belong to the hospital. And the question is, someone outside of those in need of the life-saving measures, how does he triage? How does he prioritize? And therefore, Rabbi Akiva is not helpful in this situation because there's no one that you can say that his life takes preference because he owns the life-saving measure. So that is not a helpful source. Another source are 2 Mishnayos in Horayot. One Mishnah says a man precedes a woman, and another Mishnah goes on to say that a Kohen precedes a Levi precedes an Israeli, and an Israeli precedes Mamzer, and a Talmid Chochem precedes an Am Ha'oretz, even if the Talmid Chochem is a Mamzer and the Am Ha'oretz is a high priest, the Mamzer, who is a Talmid Chochem, precedes. So it seems like this is a criterion that we should follow in order to prioritize in cases of life-saving where there's not enough sources. The term used in the Mishnah on all these is lahachayot. Ish kodem leisha lahachayot, kohen kodem lelevi lahachayot. And the question is, what is the meaning of the term lahachayot? So some say lahachayot means to give parnose, to save someone from starving of death. So in this situation, this Mishnah is appropriate. However, most poskim say that lahachayot is more than that. Lahachayot is actually saving the life of a person. So then it really is in relation to any situation of a pandemic or a mass casualty situation that you need to save and you don't have enough people or enough measures to save, and therefore you go according to these priorities. Interestingly, the Rambam, who rules on saving life, the second Mishnah, starting from Kohen, precedes Levi and so on, But on a man precedes a woman, he only says that it takes precedence in cases of captive redemption, but not in regular life-saving situation. So why did he divide between the Mishnah of a man precedes a woman and the Mishnah of Kohen precedes a Levi? That is something discussed by the Nosei Kelim of the Rambam. However, the greatest poskim in our generation and some in previous generations ruled that this Mishnah, this priority described in the Mishnah, cannot be applied as such in a simple way. First of all, it is in many of these priorities are very difficult to ascertain. How do you know that the one that you approach amongst the 20 that are injured or suffering from the corona disease is a Kohen, is a Levi, is a Mamzer? Do you ask before you start treating who is a Kohen and you start treating him? And if someone says, I'm a Kohen, how do you know that he's a Kohen? Maybe he learned this Mishnah and he knows that the Kohen has precedence and he says he's a Kohen. Do you have time to investigate and to find out whether he's really a Kohen or not? And whether he is a Talmid Chochem or not, how do you assess that? Do you ask everyone to recite the Mishnah in Horayos to see that he really is a Talmid Chochem? Obviously, these are matters that are very difficult to ascertain, and therefore, in practice, they are not used. And both Reb Moshe Feinstein and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in their respective responsa, Igros Moshe and Minchas Shlomo, they both ruled that it is very difficult to rely on this Mishnah, and in practice, we actually don't rely on it, and we are, again, left with the question, so how do we prioritize today in case of mass casualties? Another issue that is important and might be of relevance, but I think it is not, is the following issue. All these issues of prioritization, including the Mishnah and Horayos and the Sugya and Baba Metzia, are talking about people who are in need to be saved, but they arrive simultaneously. But if they arrive in succession, then the rule is first come, first serve. So that if someone comes in the morning and he's in need of a life-saving measure and I gave it to him, and now an hour later comes someone else and now I am short of the measure to save his life, then the one that came first, I already started treating him, he takes priority. That is in cases where one comes after the other. However, in a pandemic situation, actually, we know for sure that even if at the moment only 5 people came and I have 5 beds in the ICU, I know for sure that in a minute, in an hour, there will be many more coming because that is a pandemic. We know that there are many, many patients out there that are arriving gradually. So that is regarded as coming simultaneously and not in succession. So the rule in triage is based only on medical factors. The principle is that the first to be treated and to use the measures to save his life is the one that on the one hand is in need of this measure. He can't wait and get the treatment tomorrow. He needs it now. And on the other hand, his situation is such that medically speaking, he has the greatest chance to survive if he gets this treatment. So that if 2 people come together and one is fit physically, has no underlying diseases, has no complications of the pandemic, of the corona, except for the pneumonia that is going to kill him, his chances to survive if he gets the ICU bed and the ventilator are very high, and therefore he takes priority over someone who has underlying diseases, is very old, and based on the medical aspect, even if he gets the treatment, his chances are much lower than the first one. So this is the determining factor. Who has greater chances from a pure medical standpoint to successfully get over the disease if he gets the treatment? So that age in and of itself is not an accepted halachic determination, different than in other countries, including the United States, where age per se, meaning the years left to live, even if he survives, are a factor. So that, for instance, if a 20-year-old person comes together with a 60-year-old person and both are in good health and they can survive if being treated, according to some ethicists, the 20-year-old will get preference merely because he has left more years to live if the treatment will be successful. That is halachically unacceptable. Every human being has the full value and every year has the full value, and we can't separate the numbers of years and based on that prefer one over the other. Even in practicality, the 20-year-old may go to the army, may drive a car, may drive a truck, he might be engaged in dangerous activities, and he might die before the 60 or 70-year-old person who is already retired and doesn't do dangerous acts, and he'll have the 10 years left fully, whereas maybe the 20-year-old will have much less. But even if we know that there'll be more years, this is not a halachic factor. The same holds true for physical or mental disability per se. That is not a reason to negatively triage a patient. Now, what are the sources? The sources for this are that if a healthy person and one in danger come together, the healthy person comes first. Obviously, healthy in this terminology is not that he is completely healthy, then why does he need a treatment altogether? But it means that he has no other medical problems except for the problem that we are going to treat him, and if we treat him, he will recover and be healthy, as opposed to someone who is already in danger, meaning that besides the illness that for which we are going to treat him, he has other problems, other medical problems that put him in greater danger, and therefore his success to recover is lower. Same is a treifa is a treifa and one who is not a treifa. The one who is not a treifa comes first, and again, the same concept, and a terminal, a non-terminal, the non-terminal comes first. These are all halachic sources, and they are all based on pure medical criteria. It doesn't matter if he is a Talmid Chochem, or if he is a male, or if he is a Kohen. It is a medical criterion. Now, when we come to determine a priority in life-saving situations, especially in a pandemic, we should look into 3 different stages of the pandemic and the treatment. The first stage is during normal times and during emergencies when there is sufficient life-saving resources and personnel. In this situation, the obligation of the country, of the government, of the medical establishment is to prepare for the event that will run into insufficiency and do whatever we can to be ready so that the situation of insufficiency will be either avoided or at least deferred much longer ahead. And the same holds true for individuals. We all, in such a stage, are required to keep all the instructions so that we will not get sick and not spread the illness and not cause a situation that will require triage decisions because of shortage. The second stage is when there is already an emergency and already we know that there is insufficient life-saving measures, but we did not yet start treating. So if an emergency room or an ICU physician are standing at the gate of the hospital and in come 20 people and we have 5 respirators, we have to make a triage decision who will get this particular treatment. And that we discussed that the criterion will be a medical criterion. There is, however, a later stage of triage, and that is when we know that there are insufficient life-saving resources and the treatment was already initiated. So that in our example, 20 people came, 5 were chosen by medical criteria to be treated. They come into the ICU, they occupy 5 ICU beds and 5 respirators, thinking at the time that they have the best chances to survive, and therefore they were prioritized over the other 15 patients who came with them. But one of them is now deteriorating, although wasn't expected or might have been expected, and now he reaches a stage that his chances are close to 0, but he is still occupying an ICU bed and a respirator. There is a form of triaging even in this stage. Now, halachically, as opposed to the legal situation in many countries, including the United States, we are not allowed to withdraw the respirator even from a terminal patient. So if he deteriorates and his chances become very low, but he's still on a respirator, we're not allowed to disconnect him from the respirator and give this respirator to someone else who has greater chances to survive, because halachically, this is an act of killing. So that even in Western societies who allow withdrawing respirator, they wouldn't allow to directly kill the one that his chances became nil in order to save someone else. But logically, they should allow it, because if they allow to disconnect the respirator, which is an act that causes directly the death of the patient, what's the difference between doing this and actually killing the patient? So the fact that they understand that actually killing, even for saving others, is never allowed, halachically, doing an act that causes death is equally never allowed. But we are allowed to reduce the amount of treatment that we are giving to this patient whose chances became very low. So for instance, we're allowed to move him out of the ICU with the respirator to a regular floor where there are many more beds and free the bed of the ICU for someone who has greater chances. We are allowed to withhold further treatments from the patient who is dying anyway, meaning not to put him on pressors, not to put him on dialysis, and so he will die sooner, but not because an act that we did. These are quite complicated decisions, which we don't have time to go in details on every of these decisions. So that is as far as triage decisions. Let me now talk about the vaccines. So I won't go into the biology and into the history of vaccines, just to say that vaccination is the most effective method of preventing infectious diseases. Many diseases that caused millions of deaths in the past were either totally eradicated or run down to very few situations that are still existing that cause a small amount of deaths. Smallpox, for instance, after the vaccines came into existence, before the vaccine came into existence, it killed over 300 million people. Today, it is an eradicated illness, and there are 0 deaths in the world from smallpox, all because of the vaccine. The same is for polio. Polio killed over 1 billion people, but today only a few hundreds are dying of polio, and usually in places where hygiene and vaccination is very poor. And therefore, it is clear that vaccines in general have saved the lives of millions. Also, there was an epidemic of German measles in pregnant women, which is a easy, light disease for the pregnant woman, but has grave consequences to the fetus. Nowadays, all women becoming pregnant are vaccinated against German measles, and we actually don't see anymore fetal diseases due to German measles. Recently, there was a wave of opposing to vaccinate against measles for some reason. And I won't go into the story of autism, it's a whole big story, but there was a small epidemic of measles, and children died again of measles, which already for decades, children did not die of measles because they were vaccinated. So it is clear that there's a tremendous and proven benefit to vaccinate against all those vaccinations that are available, especially and only those who are approved by professional regulatory bodies such as the FDA, Ministry of Health, and so on, and accepted by most outstanding experts. So just to mention that when the smallpox vaccination was invented or was found, that Tiferet Israel, in the end of his interpretation on Mishnayos Yuma, wrote that it is permissible to give inoculation against smallpox, even though some die of the vaccination, as long as we know that contracting smallpox is much more dangerous than the few cases of death due to vaccination, and therefore it is permissible to put oneself into a small danger, a small risk, a remote risk, in order to save himself from a certain risk. That is, in those days when science was very poor and validity was very small, and therefore there might have been cases of death. This is not the case in modern vaccinations, and therefore it's not only permissible, but actually obligated. And whoever doesn't follow such an obligation, the Rambam writes in his interpretation in the Perush HaMishnayos on Psochim, that someone who is relying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu or nature will save him, despite the fact that a physician can help him with medicine or with preventive medicine, is similar to a hungry man who refuses to eat bread and hopes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will save him from the disease called hunger. Obviously, that is forbidden to rely on such miracles, and one has to do what is right to do. So the new vaccine, and I won't go into probably you heard about the messenger RNA vaccine, which was proven to be safe and effective. And I can tell you from Israel's experience, over 5 million people in Israel were vaccinated, more than 3 million already with the second vaccination plus a whole week that passed. And actually, no seriously ill patient due to coronavirus was admitted to any hospital in Israel who was fully vaccinated, and no death case do we know in Israel of someone who was vaccinated and contracted the disease. So that is really a major proof of the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine. In Israel, we use the Pfizer. Soon we might start using the Moderna as well, but at least the Pfizer we know. And I think this laboratory experience is much better than the experiment itself that Pfizer conducted, which was due to this experiment approved by the FDA. So we can confirmed that indeed it is a very effective mode of prevention, and it is a safe mode of prevention because the side effects and complications are negligible in so many millions of people in Israel, and even more so in the world. I have the number 123 million doses of the vaccine as of February, beginning of February. So by now there are many more, and there are no reported serious side effects. So I don't want now to go into the arguments of what will happen in the future and was it done correctly or not. Suffice it to say that it is clear that it is the only way to save the world from this pandemic. The world all over has tried so many ways to prevent this pandemic by lockdowns, by quarantines, by masks, by distancing, by all kinds of medications. Nothing has stopped the terrible pandemic except for this vaccine, which we see it very effective now in Israel as a whole country, and it is effective in many other countries in regions where it's done appropriately, and therefore that's the only way to stop this pandemic, and therefore it is an obligation, a halachic obligation upon everyone that should vaccinate himself, not only for his own sake to save his life, which is an obligation, but also for the sake of saving others by cutting the train of infection and saving elderly and people with underlying diseases, and even healthy people who have been affected by this, by the corona, and either died or suffer from serious consequences. Incidentally, in Israel, there's a whole number of pregnant women who contracted the virus, became seriously ill. Some of them even died. All of them had to undergo cesarean section at a preemie level. The babies either didn't survive or are prematurely born with the consequences of prematurity. And all these women are women that were not vaccinated. So that it is clear that this is a life-saving measure. And therefore, one should approach it and be vaccinated. There are interesting halachic questions and also legal questions. Can we punish someone who refuses to be vaccinated, although he can be vaccinated? Medically, there's no reason for him not to be vaccinated. The reason to enforce him to be vaccinated or to punish him if he doesn't want is because he might cause harm and damage to others. And the society is here to protect others from a danger that can be avoided. But in democratic countries, it seems like it's very unlikely that a criminal level will be accepted to punish someone who refuses to be vaccinated. But on a tort level, it is certainly halachically not only permissible, but actually obligated upon governments to restrict the freedom of people who refuse to be vaccinated when they might be in contact with the public, such as people who manage hotels or restaurants or businesses, theaters, and so on, and especially teachers and nursing schools, and also healthcare providers who refuse to be vaccinated. They may cause damage to their patients, to their fellow people, and therefore they should be excluded from these businesses until they either are vaccinated or recover themselves from the disease. So now, as to a priority, here the priority is a little different than what we discussed on triage for life-saving situations. And again, it comes because of the two different situations usually. In the first instance of life-saving people who are going to die unless they get the life-saving measure, and this is in shortage, the one who gets it will survive, the one who doesn't get it will die. In the vaccine situation, those who are not getting it right away are not in an immediate danger. Obviously, as long as they are not infected, they can go on without being vaccinated. They are in a greater statistical danger that they might contract the virus and they might become very sick and they might die. So the question here is, A, not a direct life-saving situation, and B, it is assumed that there will be enough vaccines to cover everyone, but it will take time until it will come into existence. And therefore, triaging here is just the order who comes first, but the other ones will eventually come in line. And that is what happened in Israel. The decision was to prioritize healthcare providers because A, they are more susceptible to becoming themselves infected, and they are doing it out of their goodwill. And B, they are needed in order to save others because these are the soldiers of the war against Corona. Next in line, or almost parallel, were older than 60 years of age, together with people who have a significant underlying disease. They came first online because they are in real danger to die, and therefore they should be vaccinated. Third in line were those who are in contact with others like teachers, policemen, or essential business places, so that they will avoid infecting others. And after we finished with all these groups, or almost finished with them, we opened it to the rest of the population from 16 years and up, because this is what Pfizer and Moderna experiments were done on. But now we are looking into vaccinating younger children, and we are waiting some results of experiments, whether it's effective and safe to do it for younger children. So this is as far as we discuss triage of vaccines. Now, there are some situations that should be looked into it. What do we do if someone comes online at a time when there is a prioritization for the elderly or for the more sick people, and he's a young, healthy person? By ethical and halachic considerations, he should not jump the line because he might cause someone else to lose the vaccination, and if he gets infected, his life will be endangered. So his line should not be skipped. Another issue is, if you have a choice of several vaccines at the same time, some are more effective and some are less effective, obviously both the government and the individual should choose the vaccine that is more beneficial. However, if you are in a place where the only available vaccine is a vaccine that has a little less effectiveness, as long as it is approved and safe, then obviously you should take it because it's better than nothing. Now, the question of a recovered corona patient, should he be vaccinated? There are different policies. In Israel at the moment, the policy is that after 3 months from recovery and on, such a person should get only 1 booster injection. And the assumption is that the antibodies that he created due to his illness, plus 1 booster vaccine, will be sufficient to keep him as if he took the 2 vaccines in a person who was never sick before. As I mentioned about the pregnancy, pregnant women should be fully vaccinated. We did it here in Israel, although it wasn't in the original experiment of Pfizer. We so far, Baruch Hashem, didn't find any complications, neither to the mother nor to the fetus, as long as we can tell, because it's a very short period of time. But on the other hand, we know that pregnant women who were not vaccinated got seriously ill, and the fetus had to be taken by C-section early, and therefore suffering from prematurity complications. And therefore our policy now is to vaccinate pregnant women, preferably from the 2nd trimester and on, but in certain places even in the first vaccination. Now, concerning Shabbos, usually one should not violate Shabbos because you can postpone it by a day or 2 and it will be okay. It's not an emergency situation. However, if you are in a place where if you won't get your turn that you called for on Shabbos, you will be deferred for a long period of time, that may put you into danger. And therefore, since the injection itself is only an Isur D'Rabbanon, or perhaps not even that, because no blood is sucked and coming out, so there's no Isur Chavola, and therefore this per se is not violating Shabbos. The question is getting to the place from your home. That should preferably done by a non-Jewish driver, and if possible, the station where the vaccination is performed should be also done by a non-Jew, because it involves writing and notifications and so on. And therefore, if it's all done by a non-Jew, there's certainly a heter to do it. If postponing it will postpone it for too long. I think I'll stop here because I think my time is over. There are specific halachic issues that came up during the pandemic, whether it has to do with davening. Now we're approaching Pesach. There are questions if you are in quarantine during Pesach, what halachas involved, has to do with bris milah, how do you perform in these days a bris, and there are many other issues that you can find in the book that I just recently published. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Steinberg. That was such an incredible guided tour of the many, many issues that we face. It is a real honor for us to be hosting you at our medical ethics conference, and it speaks to the passion of our students that they wanted such an eminent posek, an ethicist, someone who's really on the ground dealing with this, to be with us. And we have a few minutes for some questions, and it's really an honor to have you. I know my own family goes way back with Shaare Zedek Hospital, maybe known the Glassers, and it's really a great coverage for us to have you here. And,
yeah, I know Paul.
That's right. So we'll just ask a couple of questions if I could. Sure. So number one, when thinking about, so in the initial portion of your presentation, you talked a lot about the different factors that are impacted by a pandemic. So I guess as someone who is really involved in shaping public policy and figuring out what to do with the hospital and figuring out what to do with, guidance for communities, I guess we were wondering, to what degree were emotional, financial considerations taken into account? Were there any steps that were taken or any risks that were taken because of those issues? Did those issues ever somehow transcend the medical concerns in any context, or are they just kind of looming in the background as an inevitable outcome of this pandemic?
Well, I assume you're talking about Israel, because I don't know what influences it has in other countries. But in Israel, it certainly influenced the policymaking. And sometimes it was covered and sometimes it was even said clearly, because economy and hunger and breakdown of people emotionally are medical considerations at the end. I mean, they are interpreted or they are called economic, emotional, and so on. But at the end of the day, it can cause to suicide, it can cause to depression, and halachically, mental illness has the same status as far as Pikuach Nefesh is concerned as a physical illness. So you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos for a mental condition. So these are legitimate considerations. Obviously, the question always is, how do you measure it? Is it already at a level that you can call it at least Sofek Pikuach Nefesh or not? And here come pressures. Obviously, if you are in a group that has greater pressure, you can voice your problems in a louder way, or maybe even threaten the policymakers in one way or another. And here in Israel, we are either right after election or right before election, and it always influences the decision of the policymakers. But one thing I think is important to realize, and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach made it a very, very distinct and clear point, that Pikuach Nefesh of Tzibur is different than Pikuach Nefesh of Yochid. The halacha is that Gacheles, Birshus Harabim, you're allowed to distinguish, you're allowed to take off on Shabbos, whereas you're not allowed to do if it's in your own house. And the reason is that in your own house, you can be careful. You can do whatever is needed and not to be injured. But in public, maybe a blind will go by, maybe an elderly person will go by, maybe someone else who can't notice, and you can't put a guard all the time. So the Pikuach Nefesh strength in Tzibur is differently calculated than in Yochid. And therefore, emotional problems for the mass are different than an individual. Economic burdens of the mass may transfer into emotional problems, into physical illness, and many other such considerations. So it is a legitimate consideration. The question always is, are we there already? And that is a matter of assessment, and sometimes it might not be assessed correctly. That's true.
Was there ever consideration from an ethical perspective with regards to prioritization in terms of people who were more cautious or people who were not cautious with regard to the pandemic? If two patients arrived and one is in a compromised position because they chose to ignore the recommendations, the other one is in a compromised position despite embracing the recommendations, would that have any halachic or moral impact on the decision?
Right. It's a very important question because we face it not only in this situation. Let's say there's a car accident on Shabbos and someone is injured. He violated Shabbos with an Isur Skila, so he's a Chayav Misa. Now he's coming to me to the hospital and I have to do many Isurei Shabbos in order to save his life. Should I take into account that he actually is a Chayav Misa and I shouldn't treat him? I mean, these questions come up in many circumstances, even from an ethical point of view. If someone is very obese and he could take care of himself and he doesn't, and he comes in with a serious diabetes situation, someone is smoking forever and he comes in with lung cancer, someone is an alcoholist, and he comes in with cirrhosis. Do we judge him for doing wrong that brought upon himself the Pikuach Nefesh in order to avoid treating him? So ethically, and I think legally in most countries, it's not a consideration. Once a patient, as a patient, steps into the hospital, he's a patient. It's not my job as a physician to judge him. I can't judge him. I don't have the tools to do it. I don't have the authority to do it. And even halachically, let's say he did not vaccinate himself, therefore he came in. Do I go into the question, why didn't he vaccinate himself? Maybe he's allergic, maybe he has considerations, maybe he has fears. I can't judge it. So therefore, practically, ethically, and legally speaking, that is not a consideration that we look into at all. Halachically, it might be, in a way, a consideration. It's called Pasha Ba'atzmo. He did something that put himself into danger. So halachically, it might be a consideration, but again, who will judge it? How much time do I have and how much expertise as a physician do I have to judge what he did? Is it really wrong? Is it a cause and effect directly or what? We don't have time to this, and therefore I think even halachically, we would treat him the same way.
Wow, okay. I think that with the introduction of the vaccine, so obviously one of the exciting elements of that progress is the prospect of being able to return to some sense of normalcy in certain circumstances. And you mentioned, and some of the other presenters mentioned, the distinction between private behavior and public behavior, and the need to continue to be vigilant in the public space to protect those who are not yet vaccinated or remain vulnerable, given all these different elements. At the same time, I think people, especially Pesach is coming, and people are trying to grab on to some sense of hope that this has an ending, that there is a day that there'll be an announcement that the pandemic is, for all intents and purposes, over. And we recognize that it's not going to be as simple as a particular moment. But I think what we're all wondering is, at what point do the risk levels related to COVID begin to merge with the general risk levels that we take in life for all sorts of behavior, to the point where we may not have eliminated those risks, but they are now at a manageable, from a halakhic perspective, place that we could then begin to, even in the public space, return to many of the normal things that we used to do before. I guess I would just ask, like, what is the process and what is the framework to try to arrive at such a determination? I know that in my own shul, I serve as the Rav of a shul, and people are ready to go. You know, people are vaccinated, they're done. They're ready to have vaccine. They want to, all sorts of things. They're ready to abandon a lot of the, and we've had to help people understand that we're not at that point yet, but they're beginning to ask. At some point, driving a car is also dangerous. So what is the process of determining when people can feel like, okay, there's some risk, but that's normative risk?
Well, medically speaking, the clear answer will be when there will be a herd immunization, when there will be a number of people who either recovered and have antibodies or were vaccinated appropriately, 2 doses of Pfizer and Moderna, maybe 1 dose of Johnson, or maybe other vaccines, and enough time passed after they were vaccinated. And people say, experts say, between 85 and 90% of the population in this situation, then we live along with the virus and we come back to total normal life. That is herd immunity that happens with measles and with rubella and other, although they are not as deadly as the corona, but still it's manageable and people can live totally normal. Nowhere are we yet at this stage, certainly not in the United States in most places, but even in Israel, we are not there yet. We are talking about maybe 50 or maybe even a little over 50% of people who can be regarded as either vaccinated or cured or recovered. That is not sufficient to cause it a herd immunity. So therefore, we have to still be careful. Now, how careful do we have to be? My personal view is that as much as you can tolerate to continue the time that was before we feel that the vaccine already done the job is preferable, so that you should wear masks everywhere, including outside, but certainly inside. You should keep distancing. You should keep hygiene of your hands, although we don't know that really it goes by hands. But I think we can be more lenient in areas which are called in Israel yellow or even green, as opposed to red and purple, in a sense that there are enough people in your neighborhood or in your community that are either vaccinated or recovered, and therefore you can open the shul with distancing within the shul, maybe capsules with plastics to divide groups if it's a big shul. And the numbers are, in Israel at least, regulated by the government. So at the moment, they allow 50 people in a building, in a closed building, and 100 people outside. So it's beginning to open. It's not the full opening, but it's beginning to open. I think that it has to be done very gradually. So if you decided that you let in 20 people to your shul now, give it 2 weeks, 3 weeks in this form. If everything goes by okay, maybe increase to 30 people. And just to test yourself if indeed in your environment you are safe. And I think with this, gradually, Bezrat Hashem, will be able to open. Whether it will happen Pesach or not, I'm not sure. Certainly in Israel after Purim, where there was really a disaster. I don't know how Rebbes and Rosh Yeshivas allowed what they allowed, but it's beyond me. I can't control. And we'll see the consequences within a few days. Usually it's 2 weeks after such an event. If it went by okay, then it's a good sign that a big majority is already protected and we can go on. If it, Chas v'Sholom, will go back, then Pesach will not be an opening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Steinberg. I want to share with you that for us in America, obviously the hardest part of the pandemic has been the loss of life and the suffering of people. Certainly after that, the emotional and the economic impact. But high up on that list is our inability to reach Eretz Yisrael. And especially for those of us who have family there, but even just feeling like we are locked out of our homeland has really been one of the really painful parts of this entire experience. So I really, on behalf of all of us, want to thank you for joining us today, just to hear your Toras Eretz Yisrael and your bringing of that flavor to our conference today was very special and very much appreciated. And we want to thank you for everything you continue to do on the behalf of the Jewish people, all the very difficult decisions that rest on your shoulders, and to thank you for joining us today very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and keep on saving yourselves and your neighbors. It's a time to be careful. And Bezrat Hashem, we hope that maybe next conference will be already a real conference.
We look forward to the next conference in Eretz Yisrael, the next YU Medical Ethics Society conference.
Even better.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
Good.
Okay, I turn it over to our prestigious presidents, our prestigious students, and thank everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Professor Steinberg and Rabbi Glasser, for this fascinating discussion. This marks the conclusion of our 14th Annual Medical Ethics Society Conference. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in person at our conferences in the coming years.
Thank you.